Chapter 176. Going to the meet. After dinner, everyone went back to the room that they were provided, and to the girls' dismay, they were all in a different room than Tatsuya's. Though Tatsuya too didn't stay in his room as Milikas made him play with him till late at night, and afterwards both of them slept in his room. And because of this, a certain maid who was waiting for her punishment was disappointed. The next day, the whole mansion was in uproar as the staff were working for the preparations for the youth devil meet. All the maids and butlers were moving from here and there, teleporting various stuff that was been kept in their residence to the place where the function was to be held. Tatsuya and Milikas, who were watching the whole scene from the side, were amazed from the tension that was present among the staff, and then Tatsuya asked, "How many people are actually there that work in the house?" Milikas looked at Tatsuya and said, "Enough to have a different maid attend you daily for a year. Maybe a few more." Tatsuya looked at him for a while, and seeing his expression, Milikas said, "I tried counting how many were there, but stopped after a while. Their numbers keep on increasing. It got very annoying." Tatsuya patted his head and said, "So is there anyone you like among them?" Milikas then looked at him with a normal expression and then said, "Due to a different maid coming at the call every time. I don't feel attraction towards a specific one." Tatsuya nodded and then said, "You have it rough, huh? Well, if you ever find someone you like, feel free to ask me for help." Milikas looked at him for a while and then said, "I think it will be better to talk to me about this once I am a bit more older." Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, "What's the big deal? You should be thanking me that I am giving you a head start." Milikas looked at him for a while and then said, "Well, thanks, I guess." Tatsuya just patted his head and said, "Don't worry, just make sure to become a fine man of culture in future." Suddenly Tatsuya and Milikas heard someone coming towards them and then turned around to see who was coming and saw Venolana and Grafia walking towards them. They stopped once they came beside them, and just as they stopped, Tatsuya felt Grafia staring at him intently. Venolana then asked, "What are you two doing?" Tatsuya and Milikas then said in unison, "Watching the commotion." Tatsuya then asked, "So what do you two need?" Venolana chuckled and said, Era, straight to the business, huh? Well, we wanted to measure your size for the clothes that you will wear in the evening." Tatsuya shook his head and said, "I thank you for your concern, but have already arranged for my clothes for the evening. You don't have to worry." He then thought, besides, Grafia is giving out a dangerous vibe. Hearing his answer, Venolana just pouted, but Tatsuya clearly heard Grafia clicking her tongue, making him more convinced about his guess. Later in the evening, Tatsuya and his group were waiting in the hall of the Gremory Mansion for one of the star of the event to come along with her peerage. Miyuki looked at the gate and said, "They sure are taking their time." Tatsuya, who was still in his casual clothes, then said, "Well, she has to stand out a bit than the others for the event." Miyuki then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Anyway, who are you going to escort for the event?" Hearing her question, all the girls who were sitting perked up and looked at Tatsuya and were looking at him with an expression which said, "Of course it would be me." Tatsuya then looked at all of them who were wearing their dresses, and he only said, "You all are looking fabulous, so I am unable to decide." Hearing his praise, the girls just smiled at him, but then Tatsuya said, "Why not decide it with rock, paper, scissors?" All of them then nodded and then gathered in a circle and started the game, and in the end, only Asia was left standing. Asia jumped in joy and said, "Yeah." She then looked at the others and with a bright smile on her face said, "In your face, losers." Hearing those words with such a cheerful voice and expression made all of them sweat drop, but soon the door was opened and the Gremory group came inside. Seeing that all of them were there, Tatsuya snapped his fingers, and then his clothes immediately changed to a black tuxedo and pants with a dark gray shirt underneath the coat. Tatsuya then said, "So shall we get going?" Hearing him, the girls, who has a slight blush on her cheeks, snapped out of trance, and Akino immediately walked towards him and was about to latch out on his arm. But before she was able to, her shoulder was held by someone. Akino then turned around and saw Asia looking at her with a glare which made her entire body stiffen up. Asia then applied a bit pressure in her grip and said in a cold voice, "Make another move and you will be in one hell of pain." Akino immediately took a step back, and Asia once again returned back to her cheerful self and hugged Tatsuya's arm and said, "Let's go then." Hearing her cheerful declaration just after incident made all of them had a cold sweat and gulped their saliva and thought, "I am glad that I didn't took his hand." Chapter 177. Meeting the Youths. All of them then stood inside a magic circle which was made by Tatsuya, and then all of them were teleported from the Gremory Mansion. The next instant, all of them appeared in front of a huge building, which was looking very majestic because of all the decoration and lighting that was present on it because of the event. Tatsuya then looked at the Gremory peerage and said, "After you, heir of the Gremory family," and did a bow. Seeing him acting playfully, Rias played along and said, "Thanks for the honor," and lifted the hem of her dress and did a court bow and then started walking. The rest of them then followed her. Rias then took a side glance at the people walking behind her and then said, "Make sure to not stir up trouble here." Tatsuya looked at his group and said, "If anyone tries to trouble you, just ignore them." Rias nodded and then said, "And if they are picking a fight, don't act rashly and take the best action possible." Tatsuya then said, "If they are picking up a fight, just ignore them. They are not worth your time." Rias nodded once again, satisfied with Tatsuya's answer. She then said, "You should be polite while answering someone who is a higher ranking than you." Tatsuya looked at his group with a smile and then said, "If anyone tries to act superior to you and try to order you around, just release enough power to stir up the whole building and make them piss themselves off. If it still not works, just attack them with an attack which destroys the whole building, or they are around the building completely to dust, and if you are still not satisfied by that, I will surely revert the area back to normal, and then we can do that again till you are satisfied. Hearing his answer, all of them looked at Tatsuya with a sweat drop, while Miyuki just smiled and nodded her head and said, yes, I will freeze this entire territory over and over again if some bitch tries to get close to Oni-sama. And a cold aura surrounded her. Seeing that the rest of the group just sighed while Tatsuya just patted her head and then said, if that bothers you then I don't mind, but just don't take this overboard and kill everyone who tries to eye me. Miyuki nodded and said, don't worry Oni-sama, I will not kill everyone who look towards you. Tatsuya nodded his head and then Miyuki thought, I will just gouge their eyes out. And a smile appeared on her face. Akino then tried to ease up the mood around them and looked at Tatsuya and then mischievously said, by the way Taka, what will you if the men out there try to flirt with one of us? Tatsuya looked at Akino and just gave a smile to her. Seeing his smile, Akino's eyes twitched and she took a step back, and all of them then thought, to all the devil in there we pray that you all don't incur the wrath of the Shiba siblings for the safety of Underworld. Tatsuya then returned back to normal and then said, well, let's get going. It will be problem if one of the stars of the event is not there. All of them then nodded their head and then started walking towards the building. Tatsuya and the others were silently walking towards the hall where the stars were asked to gather, but on their way, they met a buffed-up man having black hair and was about their age. Seeing the man, Tatsuya grinned and walked ahead of the group, confusing the Gremory group, while the rest of them gave a knowing look to Tatsuya. Tatsuya stood in front of the man with a small smile on his face, while the man had a smile as well. Tatsuya then raised his fist and said, long time no see Sarorg. Sarorg nodded his head and bumped fists with Tatsuya and said, yes, it's certainly been a long time. How about it want to have a spar of the occasion of our meeting after a long time? Tatsuya just sighed and said, you really have a one-track mind, at least remember what you are here for. Sarorg just laughed out loud and then playfully smacked Tatsuya's back and said, well, there was no problem in asking, right? And who knows that you might have accepted as well. Tatsuya just sighed and said, you know that I don't like troublesome things. Rias and the others then came closer to the duo and Sarorg then noticed them and with a curt bow said, a pleasure to meet you Rias and her peerage. He then looked at Tatsuya's group and said, long time no see. I hope that you all are doing well. Rias then gave a court bow as well and then said, the pleasure is all mine Sarorg. Tatsuya's group then nodded their heads and said, long time no see Sarorg-san/Kuin. We hope that you are fine as well. Rias then looked at her peerage and then introduced them to Sarorg. Sarorg then looked at Isami and then said, I really hope that I can fight you someday, and moved his hand forward. Isami, who was a bit nervous, nodded her head and shook hands with Sarorg. Sarorg was about to try the strength that Isami possessed by gripping her hand tighter, but before he was able to, Tatsuya came between then and separated their hands and said, I would really appreciate if you don't hold the hand of my girl for so long Sarorg. Sarorg then just gave a wry smile and said, now, I don't have such intentions, I just wanted to test her strength. Tatsuya just smiled and said, want me to take her place instead? I can help you with the grip test if you want. Sarorg immediately had cold sweat, and he said, I don't want to have a completely crumbled hand just before the meet. Rias and the other devils who were looking at the friends who were talking to each other looked at Tatsuya's group and asked, so how do you all know them? They looked at them and just told the story about their meeting, although hiding some sensitive parts. Tatsuya then asked, so what are you doing out here and where's your peerage? Sarorg made an annoyed face and said, well, the Agars and the Astaroth heir arrive after me, and though the situation was still peaceful there, but when the heir of the Glaciolabalas arrived the situation turned very idiotic, and even though I tried to control the situation, so I left and came out to have some fresh air. Tatsuya nodded and said, let me guess the delinquent and Erichan must be arguing. Sarorg sighed and said, you really know them well. Tatsuya nodded and said, well then let's go and meet up with them. And started walking with Sarorg towards the hall with the rest of them silently following them and devils asking the questions to the Tatsuya group. Soon they reached the room and Sarorg opened the door, and the scene that welcomed them were two groups of people standing in front of each other ready to fight any moment. Tatsuya saw them, and then his gaze fell upon a green-haired girl whose arms were folded under her breasts glaring angrily towards a rowdy-looking man. Tatsuya sighed and said, you two really get along right, Erichan, delinquent Kuin. Hearing those nicknames, both of the man's and the girl's bodies flinched, and then the green-haired girl said, this nickname. The other male then continued, only means one thing. Both of them then turned their head and looked at Tatsuya with a surprised expression on their faces, while Tatsuya just waved his hand and said, the man of culture, Tatsuya at your service. Chapter 178, Cherry Boy. Just as Tatsuya's presence was noticed by the two groups, the men who were looking like some delinquents got on their knees and lowered their heads and shouted at the same time, good evening, Aniki. We are honored to have you here. The people behind Sikvera bowed as well and said, good evening, Taisama. Seeing the show of respect, the Gremory group and one other devil who was standing in the corner of the room were surprised, while the kings of the peerages just sighed. Sarorg looked at the scene in front of him with satisfaction and said with a nod, as expected, you still have their respect. Tatsuya then waved his hand and said, now, you all don't need to go that far. I am happy to see you all, but please raise your heads. As he said that, all the devils who were either bowing or were on their knees stood up and looked at Tatsuya with a smile on their faces. Tatsuya then inspected each one of them and said, looks like you all have got considerably stronger, especially you Erichan. The aura around have changed considerably. Speaking of aura, Sikvera then shifted her glasses and a small smile appeared on her face on being praised. Tatsuya then turned his head towards Zephyrdal and said, "You seem to have gotten rowdier than before, right, delinquent-kun?" Hearing that, Zephyrdal got a bit pissed and said, "Bastard. You? Why have you come here?" Tatsuya then walked towards Zephyrdal and smacked his head lightly and said, "Is that how I taught you to talk to your superiors?" Zephyrdal, who was holding his head, looked at Tatsuya with a glare and then said to his peerage, "What are you bastards looking at? Deal with him." But his peerage looked at him and with a wry smile on their faces said, Now, boss, don't be like that with Aniki. You should be glad that he is not kicking your ass like the last time." Just as he said that, a chuckle was heard by everyone, and Zephyrdal immediately turned his head to see who was making fun of him and saw Sikvera covering her mouth with her hand. He glared at her and said, "Bitch, you have some guts to mock me. Do you want your virgin self to be harassed that badly?" But just as he said that, Tatsuya said, "But aren't you a virgin too, Zephyr-kun?" And just as he said that, Zephyrdal got embarrassed and looked at Tatsuya with a glare and said, "Oh, of course, and..." Tatsuya then looked at him with an amused expression and said, "Heh. Then when was the time that you got the chance to swipe your V-card? How long did you last? Who was the girl? Was it a girl or a boy? If it was a boy, who was on the top?" Hearing his question, all of them were left speechless and looked at Zephyrdal with a curious gaze. Seeing their gazes, Zephyrdal's body got stiff and he thought, "Fuck, why the hell are these bastards looking at me like that? Wait, why is my peerage moving away from me? Oi, bastards, I am straight." Seeing that he was not answering, one of the members of his peerage said, "Boss, do you really swing that way?" and took a step back. Hearing that question, all of the men in the room took a step back and looked at Zephyrdal intently. Zephyrdal, who was now totally pissed, shouted, "Of course not. I am totally straight. Besides, I still have to do it. So stop looking at me like that, bastards." Hearing his answer, Tatsuya smiled and said, "See, you are still a virgin." Hearing that, Zephyrdal realized what he said and then clicked his tongue and stomped his feet on the ground. All of them then started laughing, making Zephyrdal angrier. He then looked at Sikvera and said, "Forget it. We still had some matters to settle, right, bitch?" Sikvera looked at him with a smirk and said, "What are you talking about, cherry boy?" And just as she said that, Zephyrdal snapped and started to release his demonic energy. Seeing which, Sikvera started to release her energy as well, making the atmosphere tense once again. Seeing that the two were not going to stop, Sarorg came forward and said, "Stop it, you two. We have a meet just after this. I don't want to use force if necessary." Zephyrdal looked at him and clicked his tongue and said, "What can a Phyllu dash?" Before he was able to finish, Sarorg moved from his place and punched him on the face, sending him right through the wall, and then said, "Oops." Tatsuya sighed and looked at the delinquent peerage and said, "Bring him back," to which they all nodded and then immediately rushed towards their king. Tatsuya then turned towards Sarorg and said, "Calm down, man." Sarorg looked at Tatsuya for a while and then released an annoyed sigh. Suddenly, the door of the room opened once again and the Citri peerage came in. Tatsuya, who saw Sona wearing a dress, rushed towards her and hugged her, making Sona flustered and said, "So tan, good evening." He then looked at her face and said, "You are looking very beautiful tonight." Sona, who saw her face very close to Tatsuya, became a blushing mess and was not able to say anything. She then lowered her head and said, Thank you for the compliment." Seeing her acting so cutely, Tatsuya moved forward and whispered in her ear, "If you act this cute, then I might eat you right now." A shiver went down Sona's spine, but before she was able to process anything and answer Tatsuya, she was pulled back by her reliable queen, Tsubaki. Tsubaki looked at Tatsuya and said, Now, you should not mess with her right now. She still have to attend tonight's meet. Why don't I accompany you tonight?" But just as she said that, she felt a huge amount of killing intent aimed at her, and she got covered in sweat. She then looked at the direction from where it was coming and saw Asia looking at her with a smile on her face. Seeing her reaction, Sona smirked and pushed Tsubaki forward and said, "Yeah, I am busy tonight. Tsubaki, why don't you accompany him tonight?" Making Tsubaki experience more killing intent coming from Asia. Suddenly, Asia felt someone tap her shoulder, and turning around, she saw a black-haired devil with a handsome face and gentle expression on his face. The devil bowed and said, "Nice to meet you. I am Dioder Dash." Before he was able to finish, Asia said, "I have a boyfriend," and walked away from him, leaving behind a completely surprised Diodora. Seeing that, Tatsuya and the rest of his group couldn't help but internally laugh at him. Chapter 179. The show begins. After Diodora was completely ignored by Asia, the delinquents soon brought back their king. Tatsuya then used his magic to heal him back, and then looked at the other young devils that were present in the room and said, "We are sorry for the commotion. Please don't think bad about him. He is just in his rebellious phase," and placed his hand on Zephyrdal's head and made him gnaw it forcefully. The delinquent looked at Tatsuya and said, "Bastard, stop acting like my parent." To which Tatsuya simply turned his head and smiled at him. Seeing his smile, the rest of the young devils just shuddered, and all of them then thought, "Just who is the devil amongst us?" Tatsuya and then others then gathered around with everyone's peerage behind their kings and Tatsuya's group behind him. Sarorg then said, "Well then, I don't think that there is any need for it, but let's introduce ourselves. I will go first. Sarorg Bale, the heir of the Bale family." Rias then stepped forward and said, "Rias Gremory, heir of the Gremory family. Sona Citri, heir of the Citri family. Sikvera Agars, heir of the Agars family. Zephyrdal Glaciolabalas, heir of the Glaciolabalas family. Diodora Astaroth, heir of the Astaroth family. After that, everyone turned their heads towards Tatsuya, who on noticing that said, "What? I am not a part of the meet. You want me to introduce myself too?" To which Sarorg said, "I mean, it's not a problem." Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, "Tatsuya Shiba, I am businessman of sorts and a human. For all those who don't know me, I just have one thing to say." He then released a bit of his aura and said, "Don't piss me off for your own sake." Feeling the pressure, he was releasing all the devils tensed up except for Sarorg, who had an excited smile on his face. Soon a butler came in the room, seeing whom Tatsuya stopped releasing the pressure and looked at the butler. The butler then bowed and informed the others that it was now the time for the meeting to begin. All of them nodded and then left the room and walked towards the main hall. Tatsuya and the others then entered the hall and then went their separate ways. Asia immediately latched onto his arm, and then all of them went around the hall with the males giving a glare towards Tatsuya. Soon Tatsuya noticed a blur coming towards him and immediately moved his hand and stopped the person coming towards him. Tatsuya looked at the person with a smile and said, "Hey Sarah, you look beautiful tonight," and then moved back his hand. Serafal looked at Tatsuya and said, "Tatsuya-chan, you look handsome as well," and immediately hugged him. Tatsuya hugged her back and said, "So are you skipping your work again?" Serafal looked at Tatsuya with an innocent expression and said, "No, I already took care of it." Tatsuya smiled and said, "So you gave your work Surzex without him noticing it?" Hearing which Serafal's brows twitched and she said, "Ugh, I don't like how you can easily read my mind." Suddenly all of them noticed a group of people coming towards them, seeing which Tatsuya raised his hand and said, "Yo, long time no see, Riser." Riser raised his hand as well and said with a bow, "Yes, it certainly has been a long time. I hope that you are doing well, Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya nodded his head and then looked at the group of people behind Riser and said, "Hello, all of you. I hope that Riser is not troubling you all." Riser's peerage shook their head and said, "Not at all. He takes good care of us." Then Ravel stepped forward and with lifted her dress a bit and gave a curt bow and said, "Nice to meet you, Tatsuya-sama." Tatsuya just smiled and placed his hand on her head and patted her, making Ravel blush a bit. "Good to see you as well, Ravel, but didn't I told you to call me just by my name?" Hearing that, Ravel looked up and said, "I cannot be disrespectful to you." Tatsuya gave a wry smile, said, "Well, I don't particularly min dash." But before he was able to finish, Ravel shook her head and said, "No, not doing that." Tatsuya just sighed and said, "Well then, do as you please," and once again patted her head. Ravel, who was lightly blushing, suddenly felt some killing intent aimed at her and slowly turned her head and saw Kaneko glaring at her. Seeing that, Ravel showed a victorious smirk towards Kaneko, making Kaneko's brows to twitch. Isami and Zenovia, who were standing beside her, suddenly felt some black aura coming from Kaneko, and Zenovia asked, "Hey Kaneko-chan, want to eat something?" Kaneko didn't even turn her head and said, "Freshly cooked fried chicken," and started walking towards Tatsuya's group. Seeing her walking, Isami looked in the direction of her path and suddenly frowned on seeing Kaneko heading towards Ravel and immediately rushed behind her. Seeing her rushing, Zenovia got confused but still followed them as she thought there was some problem. Tatsuya and his group, who saw the three figures coming towards them, turned their heads and smiled. Tatsuya looked at Kaneko and said, "What happened, Kaneko? Missing me already?" Kaneko didn't say anything and stood beside Tatsuya and glared at Ravel. Seeing that, Tatsuya said, Now, don't fight here." But Kaneko then said, "Senpai, the chicken here is not good. You should stay away from it." Noticing the meaning behind her words, Ravel's smile twitched and she said, Tatsuya-sama did not need the advice of someone who only likes stinky fishes. After which both the girls started glaring at each other, and soon their aura unconsciously started to leak out. Tatsuya then immediately gave a hand chop to both of them and said, Now, we don't want to ruin the mood here, now do we?" Suddenly the lights dimmed down a bit, making everyone a bit curious, but soon they noticed a spotlight aimed towards the door of the hall. Serafal then immediately panicked and said, "Crap, I have to leave now," and then teleported from the spot, only to appear walking through the door with the rest of the Satans, with the other three glaring at her. Tatsuya then said, "So the show begins, huh?" Chapter 180 Wings. After the Maos entered the hall, the people started making a commotion on seeing all four of them together, which completely overshadowed the entrance of the council men who entered them. Tatsuya looked at the council and noticed that some of them had a displeased expression on their faces, and then a small smile appeared on his face after he read the minds of those devils. The info given by Surzex is indeed correct. Well, nothing less expected from a Mao. All of them then got on the stage, and then Surzex came forward and gave a speech about how the youngsters were important for the future and all. Once he was done, a devil who was a councilman stood up and said, "Now, we will continue on with the youth meet, but before that we would like to hear about the goals from the devils who will lead in the future." Hearing that, the six kings came forward and stood in front of the stage. Sarorg then took a step forward and said, "My goal is to become a Mao in the future," with a resolute expression on his face which made all the council men praise him for his goal and all. Tatsuya, who noticed this, sighed, and then suddenly he heard a voice. "They sure know how to butter up someone." Tatsuya then turned his head and saw Azazel standing beside him with a glass of wine in his hand. The rest of the group saw him as well, and the devils exclaimed, "Sensei, you are here as well?" Azazel looked at his students and just nodded his head. Tatsuya nodded his head as well and then said, "Well, what else can they do? Currently Sarorg is considered to be the strongest youth. They all are trying to make up a favorable relationship with him. They have to carry out their business in the future as well, right? Hearing him, Azazel looked at him for a while, but soon shrugged it off. Tatsuya was the last person he wanted to piss off. He didn't want his wings to be torn off after all. While both of them were talking, the other young devils told about their dreams as well, and finally Sona's turn came, and Tatsuya then stopped and looked at Sona. Sona then came forward and said, I want to open a school which expertises in preparing the students for the raiding game. After saying that, one of the councilmen then said, but isn't such a facility already available? Sona nodded her head and said, yes, but that is only available for the noble and high-class devils. Another councilman then said, then does that mean that you want to open a school which the low-class devils can attend? To which Sona just nodded her head. The councilman just blinked his eyes for a while, but soon burst out laughing, after which many people started laughing as well. In the end, only Tatsuya's group, Azazel, Mao's, young devils, and some of the councilmen were the ones left who were not laughing. Serafal was glaring at the councilmen while Surzex was looking at Tatsuya with a panicked expression on his face. Tatsuya looked back at Surzex, and once their eyes met, Tatsuya showed a friendly smile to him. Surzex immediately understood that if he interfered with Tatsuya's actions, then death is the last thing that he should be worried about. Tatsuya, who saw Surzex understanding what he wanted to convey, was suddenly called by a voice. These damn devils, they don't even know about President, and are still mocking them. Aniki, aren't you angry at all? Tatsuya turned his head, and saw Saji glaring at the crowd who was laughing at Sona. Tatsuya then smiled and said, do you really think that I am totally calm? I want to destroy the whole underworld right now. It's just that it will not make Sona happy, even if I did something like that. Hearing his friendly tone, the group who was standing near him took a step back. They clearly understood that Tatsuya was totally pissed right now, and if he got angrier, then it would be very bad for them. Azazel, who heard Tatsuya wanting to destroy the underworld, got panicked but soon released a sigh of relief when he gave a silent prayer to Sona. Saji, who understood how pissed his Aniki was, tried to change the topic and said, but why are they so opposed to her dream? To which Tatsuya normally said in a bit loud voice, isn't that obvious? These devils are scared. And just as he said that, the whole room got silent, and all of them looked in their direction. The gazes who saw Tatsuya were both filled with surprise and hate, and seeing that Sona couldn't help but get worried for him. Tatsuya, who saw that all the gazes were at him, looked back at all of them and said, what? Isn't that the reason? Why get silenced all of a sudden? To which the councilmen just glared at him, and the one who stared laughing pointed at him and said, who the hell are you, and how dare you say something like that? Tatsuya looked at the devil, and smirked, which made the devil get more pissed. Tatsuya then said, well, aren't you scared that your position that you got because of your lineage will be taken if what Sona said were to happen? Saji, who was confused by what Tatsuya said, ignored the surrounding and asked, what do you mean by that, Aniki? Tatsuya looked at Saji and said, well, just think about this. In the devil society, those who are born in the noble families are given the title of a high-class devils from their birth. Do you really think that they have the strength of a high class at that time? And then those high-class devils are given their peerage pieces at a certain age to form their own peerages. With these pieces, they can even turn people from other races into devils. Saji then thought for a while, and then nodded his head, confirming that he understood till then. Tatsuya nodded his head as well, and then said, now do you think that devils would reincarnate any normal human they want? No, they will reincarnate someone who have something special about them, like a sacred gear, strong weapon, superior genetics, etc. Now the devil society, which promotes the low-class devils based on their strength and the knowledge that they have about their society and the house to which they belong to. Just think about if such devils who are reincarnated as low-class devils were to be given an opportunity to have the knowledge about the devil society and the raiding games. Won't they rank up very quickly, as they were strong from the beginning? Their growth might also be fast, and since they possess the sacred gears, other things like that, it is only obvious that these new devils will easily rank up to high class. He then turned his head and looked at the devil, who clearly had a displeased expression on his face, and said, so it is only natural for them to get worried, as if more capable devils started to emerge more and more, their positions will be in danger. The devil stood up from his seat and said, Brat Dio, you know who are you talking to? I am not only a high-class devil but a member of the Devil Council as well. Do you have any idea what will happen to you? Tatsuya just looked at him with an amused expression and said, Heh, you are a high-class devil? To which the devil just glared at Tatsuya and said, yes, I am, and I can clearly say that you will never reach such a position in your life. Tatsuya just chuckled and said, is that so? Then you won't mind to prove that you are a high class, right? The devil then said, what? You want me to prove that I am a high class? Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, I mean, if you are actually a high class, then you won't mind, right? The devil just got more pissed and said, sure, I accept. Tatsuya just showed a gentle smile on his face and clapped his hands together and said, so nice of you. Then you won't mind to take out your wings, right? A high-class devil must have 3 pairs of wings as far as I know. So you must have them as well, right? And just as he said that, most of the councilmen got surprised and looked at the devil, who was standing with a panicked expression on their faces, while the devil in question was left completely speechless and was just looking here and there because of nervousness. Chapter 181. Weak and frail. The devil, who was acting arrogantly just a minute ago, was now completely silent and was looking around the hall with nervousness. Seeing that, Tatsuya smirked and said, what happened? Weren't you going to show your high classiness to all of us? Spread your wings. He then took a step forward and said, Or is it that someone cut off your wings earlier? The devil who heard him got pissed, but feeling all the gazes that were at him made him unable to speak. He then turned his head towards a particular member of the council with an expectant gaze and in a low voice said, "Lord Bale." The person who was called then turned his head and looked at the devil with narrowed eyes and said in a cold tone, "What?" Hearing his tone, the devil shuddered and said, "In nothing." Lord Bale then turned his head and closed his eyes and thought, "Humph. These councilmen who have been selected just because of their house are getting too arrogant nowadays. Let them suffer. Not having power to support the devil pride, then you are just trash." Tatsuya looked at Lord Bale for a while and thought, well, he is a good bastard. Tatsuya then looked at the devil and said, "What are you hesitating for? Show the world you high classiness." Hearing that all the devil from the council who were in the same position as the devil glared at Tatsuya, to which Tatsuya just smiled and said, "I know I am handsome, but you don't have to stare at me." Tatsuya then looked back at the devil in question, and after waiting for a while he said, "Are you feeling shy about showing your wings in front of so many people?" To which the devil blinked for a while and then said, It's not like I am embarrassed. It's just that you are not worthy of seeing my majestic wings." And at that, all devils in the room thought at the same time, "Bullshit." Tatsuya looked at him with a smile and then said, "Then how about a demonstration of power?" Hearing that, the devil once again became a bit nervous and said, "And how would that confirm that I am a high class?" Tatsuya then said, "Well, you just have to fight a fellow high class. That's all." The devil then started thinking, fighting a fellow high class, considering all the people that are here are the youths, the Maos, council. The only high class that I can think from are from the council. They will not GI against me.
Okowo.
The devil then said, fine, but do it quick, pick up someone who is willing here and now. I don't have a lot of time." Tatsuya then smiled and walked forward and pulled 2 people. "Choose whichever you want to fight. The ones here are the 3rd son of the Phoenix clan, Riser Phoenix. The other is the heir of the Bale clan and the strongest youth, Sarorg Bale." Seeing the 2 people, the devil council was once again shocked and looked back at the devil who was to fight PNLY to find him completely motionless. How the hell am I supposed to fight these 2? I remember that I only won against Riser because he himself backed out. Not to mention, the son of Lord Bale is said to be stronger than many genuine high-class devils. On the other hand, the 2 who have been pulled by Tatsuya were confused as well, and seeing their faces, Tatsuya said, "Just cooperate, and if you win, I will give you a reward as well." Hearing the word reward, both Sarorg and Riser became spirited and their aura started leaking out of their body and a grin appeared on their faces. A reward from Tatsuya-san is worth can be of a lot more worth than sucking up to the council. I can ask him for a fight if I beat the shit out of this council man. Both of them then looked at the devil and said, "Please pick me, I am ready to fight you with all my might." Both of them then looked at each other and then glared and said, "Back down. I will be the one to fight him." Riser is not someone who will hear to the likes of you. Riser wants to fight him. So you back down. Riser will take care of him. Both of them then started to get agitated, and soon their auras started to get wilder and wilder. Feeling the auras, the most of the council men gulped their saliva, and the said devil was sweating. He then looked at Tatsuya and said, I don't mind fighting either of them, but you were the one who questioned my authority, so you should be the one who should fight me." Tatsuya then grinned internally and thought, he took the bait. While the other who knew of Tatsuya's prowess thought, he is in deep shit now. Tatsuya then innocently said, "Are you saying that you want to fight a weak and frail human like me? I should tell you the strongest thing that I fought was a lizard, Great Red." Just as he said that, the people who knew him thought, frail and weak my ass. Hearing that, the devil got delighted and thought, he is a human, fuck yeah. He is so dead. The devil once again became arrogant and said, so you were the guest that the Maos talked about. Acting arrogant in a place where you don't belong. Looks like someone has to punish you." Hearing that, Tatsuya just grabbed Miyuki and Asia, who were about to beat the shit of the devil, and said, "Oh, so you want to punish me, huh? Then I accept your challenge." The Maos then looked at the devil and said, "Our condolences are with you." The devils were a bit confused by that, but still shrugged it off and said, "Don't hold back, human. This might be the last day of your life." To which Tatsuya was about to say something, but Surzex interrupted him and said, "Oi, hold back a bit, we don't want to have casualties here." "Yeah, I don't want to see the end of the world." Tatsuya looked at Surzex and said, "Don't worry, I will only swing my sword." Surzex, who was still uneasy about that, nodded his head and thought, what's the worst can happen if he were to just swing a sword? Just as they were about to make an imaginary field, a magic circle appeared besides the Maos, and 2 people appeared out of it. Tatsuya looked at the 2 people and said,
Yo Michael, Gabriel.
"Good evening." Both the seraphs then looked at Tatsuya with a smile and then returned the greetings. Michael then noticed the tension in the atmosphere and asked Surzex about the matter, and after hearing it looked at the devil and said, "Even though we are from different factions, you have my condolences." To which the devil was once again confused, but still shrugged it off. The Maos then made an raiding game field for Tatsuya and the council men for the battle, and both of them were standing 100 meters away from each other. Suddenly a huge screen appeared in the sky, and the devil's face was visible in it. "You can still back away if you want." To which Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Oh, don't worry, I will hold back enough." The devil then clicked his tongue and said, "To show how generous I am even after you disrespected me so much, I will let you make the first move." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Well, I will gratefully take you up on that. He then formed a sword out of magic and raised it up in the sky. The sword had a golden hilt with a blue handle and a shining silver blade. Seeing the sword, both Michael and Gabriel felt a lot of holy energy but still didn't know what that sword was. Golden lights started to come out of the ground and gather around the blade, making it shine in a golden light. Tatsuya then smirked, and then the speed of the light particles which started to gather around the sword increased, and a huge sword made of light was formed in the sky. Seeing the size of sword and the amount of holy energy that it was emitting, the devil's face paled, and his whole body started shivering. You have the guts to insult Sona in front of me. Like hell you are going to let you live?
X.
The light sword started to get bigger and waves of energy started to come out from the sword, making a strong gust of wind. Tatsuya then used space lock so that no one could interfere with them, and then moved his hand a bit backwards, readying to swing the sword. Caliba. Tatsuya then swung the sword in devil's direction, and suddenly a huge wave fully made of holy energy was fired at the devil, completely engulfing his body. Seeing the scene in front of him, Surzex smacked his head in the table and thought, like hell, just a swing of sword can't make things worse. Chapter 182, The Council. After Tatsuya confirmed that the devil was dead, he teleported back at the venue hall and noticed that all the devils were looking at him with both awe and fear. Tatsuya then looked towards Diodora and decided to hear what he was thinking. That attack was certainly powerful, but I think that was the power of the sword itself. Also, it being a holy sword was also a reason for the death of the devil. Anyways, I have the power of Ophis. I will not have any problems with some small fry human. Hearing that, Tatsuya internally smirked. Suddenly, he felt some devils coming towards him and turned his head and saw the devil council walking towards him with Lord Bale leading them. Lord Bale then stood in front of Tatsuya and looked at him with a stern expression and said, "You certainly possess a powerful weapon." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Oh, I am honored to hear your praise." Lord Bale then said, "But you should know that killing a member of the council will certainly make you our enemy, even though you are in an alliance with us." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "I think you are mistaken. Me and my group are not in an alliance. We have been neutral from the beginning." Besides, was he really a member of the council? A devil who was standing at the back of the group said, "What do you mean? If CO, you are, SE he was a member of the council?" The devil then became confused. Hearing him, the other members of the council became confused as well and started to discuss among each other. Hey, was he really the member of the council? Who are you talking about? The one that the human brat just killed. Oh, that one I don't know. Which family did he belong to? I don't know. The commotion started to get louder and louder, and seeing that, Tatsuya smirked and thought, mind control is simply awesome. In just an instant, they even forgot about the devil. Then one of the devils said, "To then too, you killed a devil in front of us. Do you think that you can get away with that?" Tatsuya just chuckled and said, "Then going by that logic, you won't mind if I take actions for all the humans that were killed in my territory by the devils, right? I don't mind swinging my sword a few more times, a little bit stronger this time." And then the sword appeared in his hand. Seeing the sword, which was releasing a holy aura far stronger than they have ever experienced from a holy sword, all the devils became tensed and took a step back. Lord Bale looked at Tatsuya with narrowed eyes and said, "Do you think that you can threaten us in our own territory?" Tatsuya looked at him with a deadpan look and said, Hello, I am literally doing that." Lord Bale looked around, then noticed the devils around them, and then snorted, seeing most of them getting scared. His gaze then fell on Surzex, and once both of them looked into each other's eyes, Surzex vigorously shook his head in denial. Seeing that, Lord Bale's eyes widened in surprise on seeing that even Surzex didn't want to mess with Tatsuya. Tatsuya then put the sword back and said, "Relax, I am not going to fight here. I was just angry because he dared to berate Sona in front of me." Hearing that, the council's eyes widened, while Sona blushed on hearing him. Lord Bale then asked, "And why would you be getting upset to that extent for Miss Citri? Going that far for a free dash? Fiancé." Lord Bale, who was about to continue, stopped and looked towards Tatsuya with an astonished expression and asked, "What do you mean by that?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, "I said that she is my fiancé, Seraphol as well." Lord Bale and most of the devils in the room got shocked and looked at the two sisters who were just mentioned. Both of them, who were now the center of attention, had different expressions. Sona got embarrassed and looked like she just wanted to hide somewhere, while Seraphol was puffing her chest proudly with an expression which said, "How about that?" She then glanced at Graphia, who was standing behind Surzex, and smirked. Graphia, who saw Seraphol's expression, smirked back, remembering the thing that happened back in the Gremory mansion. Seeing the expression, Seraphol, hot a bit panicked, and looked at Graphia with a glare which said, "What happened between you two?" Graphia, as if understanding what Seraphol was asking, showed a cheerful smile on her face, and then looked away. Seraphol, who saw that was about to attack Graphia, stopped herself after realizing where she was and thought, "I will deal with that maid later." Some of the devil from the council then looked at Seraphol and Sona and said, "I didn't know that both of you will fall so low that you will get engaged with a human. Both of you have really degraded the reputation of us devils." Hearing that, both Sona and Seraphol glared at Lord Bale, who didn't even flinch at that. Tatsuya looked at those devil and then thought, "Looks like there is going to be quite a news in tomorrow's underworld newspaper." Surzex, who noticed Tatsuya's expression, thought, "Looks like my work is going to increase by a large scale," and slumped his shoulders. Tatsuya then clapped his hands, becoming the center of attention once again, and said, Now don't scare my fiancés, otherwise there might be something funnier happen here." and took out Excalibur and started charging the magical energy in it, making its blade glow. The councilmen who were standing closest to Tatsuya took a few steps back, and then except for the Bale, the rest of them started to flare out their auras. Tatsuya, who noticed the huge amount of aura that was coming out of them, yawned and passed more energy in the sword, and moved his hand upwards, and once again a huge golden beam started forming above its blade, making all the devil, including the Moss, panic at the amount of holy aura. Tatsuya then said, "I don't mind if you want to have a go with me, but do you have the guts?" Hearing him openly insult the council, the devil got shocked and looked towards the council. The councilmen themselves got angered by the insult that Tatsuya threw at them and glared at him. Some of the members were about to argue to him, but Lord Bale then raised his hand, making his fellow councilmen stop, and then said, "We should not let the matters escalate. We don't want the young devils to die this early." He then turned around and said, "I will pretend that such a thing didn't happen here, and I hope that we don't meet again, Huma, Tatsuya Shiba." Seeing him, the other councilmen also followed him while gritting their teeth. Tatsuya, who heard Bale's thoughts, muttered, "He seriously is an interesting bastard. Just because most of the devils here were pure, he left. He didn't even had an intention to back down from the fight. He truly possesses the pride of the devils." Tatsuya then put back his sword and said, "I am going to the washroom," and then left the hall, leaving behind the people completely silent. The devil council who were walking back to were complaining to Lord Bale about Tatsuya. Bale, who was silently listening to their complaints, looked back at them and said, "Then do any of you have the strength to stand against his attack?" Hearing the question, all of them got silent and lowered their heads. Lord Bale looked at them for a while and said, "Only speak about this when you have some kind of idea," and started walking again, seeing which the others started following soon. All of them then entered the room, but once the last member entered, the door got closed on its own and then disappeared from the devil's sight. Seeing that, the devils started panicking but stopped once they heard a voice. "Good. Now that you all are here, let's start the discussion." Chapter 183. Please go through the documents. After Tatsuya left the hall, he silently walked towards the washroom. He then fixed his clothes and appearance, and once checking that everything was fine, he sighed and turned serious and said, "Let's start," and made some clones. The clones then looked at each other and nodded their heads, and once everyone did that except for the real one, the rest of them got equipped in the covert mobile suit, the suit that Tatsuya wore in the movie. Tatsuya looked at the now suited up clones and said, "Deal with them." And all of them nodded their heads and teleported from the spot. Tatsuya had a small grin on his face and then left the room, leaving the job to his clones, and said, "Let's go back, Odin must be arriving soon," and then went back to the hall. Meanwhile, the rest of his clones scattered all around the underworld, taking their positions and doing the job that Tatsuya had given them, while one of them went to the room where the councilmen would be arriving later and took a seat for himself and turned around so that he was not visible. Soon the members started entering the room, and once he confirmed that all of them were in the room, he made a replica of the room in his Kimiri dimension and teleported himself and the other devils in there without letting them know of it. "Good, now that you all are here, let's start the discussion." Hearing his voice, which was different from his original voice, the devils flinched and turned around towards the source of the voice. Tatsuya, clone, then turned around and said, "Now, gentlemen and ladies, will you please take your seats? We have a lot to discuss," and opened his arms and took out a bunch of papers and a pen and placed them in front of each seat on the table. Seeing him, who was covered in a full bodysuit and had a mask as well, the devils got wary of him and started releasing their demonic power. Lord Bale then said, "Who are you, and how dare you enter this room without our permission?" Tatsuya looked up and said, "If you have the time to bicker about this, it would be wise if you cooperate with me. I promise that it will help the devils as well." Hearing him, some of the councilmen got angry and fired their demonic energy at him. "How dare you order us around? Know your place." But Tatsuya didn't flinch and just raised the pen that was placed on the table and simply swiped his hands towards the attacks coming towards him and said, "Full counter." And in an instant, the volume and power of the attacks doubled and was reflected back at the devils, who seeing that immediately formed some barriers to protect themselves. Tatsuya then simply put the pen back and said, "I won't say this again. Take your seats," and raised a bit of his aura. Feeling the amount of pressure, the devils got surprised and then started sweating. All of them glared at the suited Tatsuya for a while and then turned their heads towards Lord Bale. Lord Bale looked at Tatsuya and said, "Is it really something that will benefit the devils?" Hearing that, Tatsuya chuckled and said in a confident tone, "Believe me, after the discussion you will be thanking me for telling you about all this." Lord Bale looked at Tatsuya silently and then slowly pulled back a chair and took a seat. Seeing that, the other devils were surprised, but once Lord Bale glared at them, they took a step back and then immediately pulled a seat as well and sat down. Tatsuya looked at all of them and said, "Now then, we are already quite delayed, so let's beg dash." But Lord Bale interrupted him and said, "Before that, tell us, who are you? Which faction do you belong to?" Tatsuya looked at Lord Bale and said, "It is very rude to interrupt someone, and as for your question, you can call me Black, and I belong to a small group called Dark Reunion." Hearing him, all the devils got serious and thought, "What is this Dark Reunion group? I haven't heard of them. Are they someone who haven't yet revealed themselves?" Lord Bale then asked, "And what would the Dark Reunion be planning contacting is this way? More importantly, helping us devils?" Tatsuya then simply said, "Don't think much. You can say that this matter is personal." He then paused for a bit and then summoned a huge bundle of papers in front of everyone and said, "Now we have wasted quite a lot of time. Please go through the documents." Hearing that, one of the devil looked at him and said, "Who are you to ord dash?" before he was able to finish, Tatsuya used his psychic powers and threw him towards the wall with a great force, making a huge crack on the wall while a lot of blood dripped from the devil's body. Seeing that the rest of the devils were shocked, but Tatsuya, as if nothing had happened, said, "Please go through the documents." "Hey, what is the meanie dash?" Once again, another devil tried to raise his voice, and this time Tatsuya used his psychic powers to make him crash in the ceiling, resulting him in getting hanged in the ceiling by his head. And once again, as if nothing had happened, Tatsuya said, "Please go through the documents." All the devils then gulped their saliva and then nodded their heads. They understood that they were not in a position where they can argue with him. The devils then took the papers in their hands and started going through them. The expression on their faces kept on changing from anger to fear. While this was happening, Tatsuya kept on looking at all of them while his telepathy was activated and was hearing their thoughts with a smile on his face. Chapter 184. Nothing much. Tatsuya, who was looking at the panicked devils with a face of amusement behind his mask, turned his head and looked towards the person who had the highest authority among the council, Lord Bale. Lord Bale himself looked calm and composed, but once Tatsuya heard his thoughts, he knew how angry he was at the moment. Tatsuya then looked at the other council members and said, "So, how do you think our information gathering is? Awesome, right?" Hearing his voice, the other councilmen, except for a few, flinched and looked towards Tatsuya. What is this nonsense? Do you think that anyone will believe this?" Tatsuya then calmly said, "Mister, your tone itself is telling that you are believing it. Besides, there are your signatures or seals on those documents as well." Hearing that the devils wanted to retort, but were not able to find anything to do so, Tatsuya then sighed and then picked up his bundle and said, "But seriously, I have to say, you devils sure like this kind of stuff. Trafficking seems to be your favorite. Not to mention you are doing the same with the pure devils as well. I see that you don't discriminate others based on their class. Truly magnificent. I can surely say that you all are not racists, and here I was told that the devils look down on the other species and even the mixed blood among them. Seems like the information was wrong. You people are not like that at all. To sell people from the 72 pillars, along with the other low-class and mixed blood devils, man, that's some serious equality levels that you follow. My respect for you all have increased significantly," and gave out a hearty laugh. Hearing him laughing, the members whose deeds were now presented in front of the other councilmen were fuming with rage, while Lord Bale and the others who worked genuinely for the council were angry at their fellow councilmen. Tatsuya then flipped a few pages and then said, "Now coming to the other part of the reports, it seems like you all are performing a lot of experiments on humans that are not necessarily safe here in Underworld, and quite a number of them belongs to our territory as well. What do you have to say about that?" Lord Bale too glanced at the culprits and said, "I would also like to know about all this and the matter concerning the trafficking. You all surely using your rights as councilmen to the fullest, huh?" All of them then gave an audible gulp and started sweating after seeing the glaring Bale. The other righteous councilmen nodded as well and looked at their colleagues and waited for their answers. One of the culprit then raised his head and said, "Lord Bale, believe us, this bastard is just bluffing. There is no way that we, the members of the council, could do something that would tarnish about name. Yeah, we cannot do something like this. He is lying. Are you seriously going to believe someone whom you have met just once? Believe us, Lord Bale, we have never betrayed you." Seeing the devil starting to make commotion, Tatsuya raised his aura a bit, making all of them shut up, and then with a calm voice said, "Looks like all this information have made you accumulate quite a lot of stress, and you all are not able to think properly. How about we all watch a video?" And then snapped his finger, and immediately a holographic screen appeared in the air, making them a bit confused. Tatsuya then snapped his fingers once again, and the past lights started to get dimmer. Tatsuya then said, "All of you should know beforehand that this video might be a horrifying experience for a few." And then the video started playing. Just as an image appeared on the screen, one of the devils said, "Hey, that's my territory." Hearing that, the other devils looked more carefully and nodded their heads. Tatsuya then chuckled and said, "Of course, needless to say, it is live as well. So you can say it is based on real events." Tatsuya then said, "You can start the show, all of you." Just as he said that, a man who was wearing the same suit as Tatsuya came in front of the camera and said, "Roger that." And then the screen broke down into smaller screens, and each of them showed at different locations. Seeing that, one by one the devils said, "Hey, that is my territory." "Yeah, mine as well." "What is the meaning of this?" "Mine is there as well." Lord Bale then looked at each of the territories and then said, "So these are the territories of all those who are suspected among us." Tatsuya clapped his hands and said, "As expected of Lord Bale. You should be knowing what fun things are about to be seen right now, right?" Hearing that, the culprits got alerted, but soon realized what was going to happen and began panicking. Tatsuya then took the documents in the hand and said, "Now, if you may please open to the third last page. You may be able to see a list of names." All of them then did the same and opened the page, and after reading the names, some of the councilmen began panicking, and then Tatsuya said, Judging by your reactions, it seems like you all know the actors who are going to work in our small video. Of course, they are the ones who have been working day and night for the sake of your acts of equality." All of them then started getting agitated and glare at Tatsuya, while the man himself was sitting in a relaxed position and had a tub of popcorn in his hand and was silently watching the movie. Seeing that, some of the devils were questioning how he was able to eat with the mask on, but they got an answer when they saw his hand pass through the mask. All of them then looked at the screen and saw the members of Dark Reunion walking closer and closer to the facilities. Tatsuya then said, "Oh, the actors are about to enter." Hearing that, all of them straightened themselves and just as Tatsuya said, a group of people came into various screens. The group of people immediately rushed towards the Dark Reunion members, but were immediately stopped by them by telekinesis as their bodies were simply held motionless in the air. Now you may check the faces of these devils with the list, and you will know how great was the part that they played. Lord Bale immediately started matching the faces, and once he found most of the members in the list, he looked at the suspects and said, I have certainly seen some of them with you all. So is there anything that you still have to say? The devils were immediately ready to make excuses, but Tatsuya stopped them and said, Wait, let's get a closer look at the facilities as well. Some of you might say that it is all just made up and we invaded their homes. The video once again started, and the sight of labs and the places where the goods were kept to be sold later were seen in the video. Seeing them, most of them were pale, but still looked at it intently. The members of the Dark Reunion then freed the goods, and seeing that some of them shouted, Hey, what are you doing? Tatsuya just smiled and didn't say anything, but just pointed his finger towards something. Seeing that the devils followed their gaze in the direction and noticed Lord Bale, fuming with rage, with some of his power of destruction being released unconsciously because of anger. Lord Bale then said, You lot have sure grown a lot, huh? Looks like you don't fear what we devils can do. Just because we are at peace doesn't mean that we have forgotten how to fight. You all were with us in the war as well, and you all certainly know that how the numbers of the pure devils have diminished. But you all still have the nerve to sell out the members of the 72 pillars. Feeling the amount of aura that he was releasing, the members of the council were having trouble in breathing, while Tatsuya was looking at them with an amused expression and thought, He certainly is a pure blood maniac. Lord Bale then glanced at Tatsuya and said, I really thank you on the behalf of all the devils. We certainly will deal with these scum. But I would like to know, what would the Dark Reunion want in return for such information? Besides, I would like if dash. Before he was able to finish, Tatsuya said, To keep my mouth shut? Don't worry, I will not tell anyone about this. Besides, I didn't come here to negotiate with you. I said in the beginning that I only want to discuss with you. Now I will just finish my own business and then go back. Hearing that, Bale looked at him with suspicion. This deal was too good to be true. He then hesitatingly said, And what would your business be? We will certainly cooperate with you if it is within our power. Tatsuya then said in a cheerful voice, Don't worry, it is not something difficult or painful. If you will cooperate, then my job will be much more easier. Bale then asked, And what would this task be, if I may ask? Tatsuya chuckled and said, Oh, nothing much, just a small massacre. And took out a pair of black guns. Chapter 185, End of the Council. Seeing him take out a pair of guns, the devils got shocked and stood up from their seats and started the preparations for attack. Tatsuya, who saw, then kept on sitting calmly and said, Now, don't be like that. I promise you will not feel any pain, and raised his gun. One of the devil then said, Do you really think that a simple gun can kill devils like us? Even Guna filled with bullets dipped in holy water will have trouble to kill dash. Before he was able to finish, Tatsuya pointed his gun towards him and pulled the trigger, and immediately the devil disappeared with a white light. Seeing that all the devils were speechless and had their mouths open wide, Lord Bale then glared at Tatsuya and said, You? What the hell do you think you are doing? But Tatsuya ignored his question and said, Lord Bale, you and the other two who are not involved with any of this shit can leave if you want. You are not a part of this massacre, yet, so please don't force yourself to come in my list of people who should be fucked up. Bale, who heard him, was angry, but he knew that he cannot do anything to him. He gritted his teeth and said, Is there no way that we can negotiate? They are still high-ranking devils. Tatsuya immediately said, Not a chance. Besides, I already told you that I didn't come here for negotiations to begin with. The only thing that I can give you as an option is whether you want to go back before they die, or you will go after they die. So what will be your choice? Bale looked down, and after thinking for a while, he said, I don't want to see this through. I cannot let someone threaten the name of us devils. I will dash. But Tatsuya ignored him and said, Oh, enough, and then pointed at the screen floating in the air and said, Look there. And all of them then looked at the screen and could see the territories of various council men. Then one of the members of the Dark Reunion appeared on the screen holding a rifle in their hands and pointed it towards the labs and places where the devils were kept for sale. All of them then simultaneously pulled the trigger. Immediately a small orbs formed over the establishments and then started getting bigger and bigger till it completely engulfed those establishments, completely destroying them. /n. The clones used material burst. Seeing that all the devils were speechless and those to the territories belonged to were not able to think rationally and kept staring at the screen for a while, and finally one of the innocent devils said, Did you really dash? Tatsuya nodded and said, Yup, that was live, but don't worry. I already moved the innocent people out of the area. They were not caught up in the attack. Tatsuya then pointed his gun towards the devils and said, Let's finish this soon, and killed every devil in the room which was found guilty of doing such tasks. Tatsuya then looked at Bale and said, I will advise you take in people who are faithful, or at the very least those who you can control in the council. He then passed by him and said, Also make sure to tell a certain red hair that not to mess with me. It would be beneficial for him. I advise you to be wary of him as well. Bale, who was continuously glaring at Tatsuya, then said, What do you mean by that? Tatsuya then said, These scumbags whom I just killed were seeking the devils in human territories. Who do you think has an ownership of a human territory in recent time? And we both know Citri cannot do such a thing. You should be knowing this since you have fought with them in the war. Bale then began thinking. It sounds reasonable. That Gremory is someone who can do something like this. I know that he always have a calm and noble aura around him, but I too think that he is faking it. Lord Baildam started charging power of destruction in his hands and said, but before all that I cannot let you go out alive. You killed all the council members in front of me? Tatsuya just looked at him and while tilting his head asked, do you really think that you can kill me? But Bail didn't say anything and kept on glaring at him. Tatsuya just smiled inside the helmet and said, you are so smart, and you are also not driven by impulses. This is something that is not seen in devils very often. Tell you what, I will give you an honor. I will let you lightly offend me once. I promise that I will not retaliate that time. The room then started glowing and Tatsuya waved his hand and said, farewell Lord Bail. I hope that we meet soon. And just remember to not do anything that will add you to my let's fuck up this person's life list. Soon the room stopped glowing and Tatsuya disappeared from the room. Bail looked at his fellow remaining council members and said in a serious tone, check whether those places have been actually destroyed or not. Also inform everyone to attack anyone from Dark Reunion as soon as they come in view. Also prepare for a list of individuals whom we should add in the council, and walked out of the room. He then formed a magic circle near his ear and said, check the hall where the meeting for the peace treaty is happening right now. Check whether the human who killed a councilman in the party earlier is present there or not. Also appoint some spies near the head of the Grimory house. Inform the mouse to meet as soon as possible. And then the magic circle disappeared. Meanwhile Tatsuya, who just got informed about all the tasks which were completed, smiled and then ordered one of the clones. Make sure that they are not able to cover up the news at any cost. Spread the info among the locals there. Some people from the media will surely notice the commotion. Also make sure to accidentally drop some evidence. Tatsuya then internally and smiled and said, and make sure to pay a visit to my dear friend Zeoticus. He must be feeling quite lonely. Soon he noticed a portal appear near the stage, and cut the connection, and then out of the portal few people appeared. Chapter 186. Research is important. Tatsuya looked towards the portal and saw Odin, Thor and Rosweiss come out of the portal along with Barakil. Odin, who noticed Tatsuya, widened his eyes in surprise and said, I didn't know that you were a part of the alliance as well? Tatsuya just shook his head and said, nah, I am not a part of the alliance. I am just an invited guest here. Odin looked at Tatsuya for a while and then shrugged his shoulders and said, well, whatever. It is good that we didn't know that you were here as well. It would have been difficult to hold back Freya and Hela from coming here if they knew. Thor and Rosweiss nodded their heads as well and Rosweiss said, that certainly would have been very difficult. Freya-sama always complains that Tatsuya-sama have not contacted her at all. Same for Hela-sama as well. Hearing that, Tatsuya and his group looked at them with a wry smile and Tatsuya said, you should be knowing that a lot have been happening in my territory as of late. So I was very busy. There is still a lot of work left back home. Hearing that, the Norse group nodded their head in understanding and Thor said, make sure to complete the work quickly. We will most likely come there for the alcohol soon. Odin nodded his head as well and said, yeah, that was really some fine alcohol. Make sure to stock up plenty for us. Tatsuya smiled and said, sure, I don't mind, but make sure to not make a scene like the last time if you know what is good for you. Hearing that, Odin burst out laughing and said, ha ha, no promises there, but we'll try our best. Seeing him acting like that, Rosweiss said, Odin-sama, mind your behavior. What will others think of you? Odin then looked at Rosweiss with a frown and said, geez, Rosweiss, uptight like always, loosen up a bit, will ya? Because of being like this is the reason that you are still single. Rosweiss immediately crouched down as black fumes started to come out of her body, and then some tears started to form in her eyes. It's not like I am yearning for a boyfriend. Sniff sniff asterisk, I don't want to stay single for the rest of my life, you. Seeing her like that, Tatsuya said, she has it hard. Azazel then came near them and said, yo, geezer from the north. Odin and Thor then turned their heads and looked at him and said, oh fallen brat, you were here as well. Tatsuya sighed and said, great, the perverts are together, and walked away. Odin then whispered to Azazel and asked, hey brat, found some new, those type of bars? Azazel grinned and said, oh, don't worry, I never leave my research midway, and took out a notebook. AD showed it to Odin. Odin then immediately began flipping the pages and said, ho ho ho, gotta go to these research facilities and expand my horizon of knowledge. You coming with me, brat? Azazel smiled and said, I am going. After all, both of them then shook their hands and said at the same time, research is important. Seeing the two perverts acting like that, the others around them looked away and tried to act like that they don't know them. Barakil then murmured, geez, how come a person like this is the leader of fallen angels? No sense of dignity at all. Even I am better than him. Because of people like you, the name of us fallen angels is tarnished. Azazel, who didn't hurt him, clearly looked at Barakil for a while and said, he must be bad-mouthing me. Well, let's ruin his image in front of his daughter. Oi, Barakil, here is the list of the SM clubs that you asked for. And immediately everyone looked at Barakil with a surprised expression, except for the ones who already knew about his great feats. Azazel then walked towards him with a smile on his face and took out a paper from his pocket and said, here, don't need to thank me. I'm already used to searching these type of stuff for you. Just try to hold back and don't come back tied in ropes. And simply walked back with a smile, and then both him and Odin started laughing while looking at Barakil's face. H had an expressions of both anger and embarrassment. Barakil immediately wanted to lash out at Azazel, but then he felt some piercing gazes at him. He lowly turned his head and saw Akino and the others looking at him with the cold and disgusted expressions on their faces. He had no problem with him being looked upon like that by others, a/n. Obviously, he would be feeling excited in such a situation. But seeing the same expression on Akino's face made him extremely sad. He wanted to explain the situation to her, but Akino simply turned her head and started talking to the devil she was talking to earlier. The other people who were standing on the stage looked at Barrakiel with pity, and all of them offered a silent prayer for him. Barrakiel then felt a hand on his shoulder and turned around only to find Azazel with his body shaking and looking at him with twitching lips, which immediately made him understand that Azazel was trying his best to hold back from laughing at him. Seeing that, Barrakiel immediately got pissed and covered his fist with lightning and punched Azazel in the gut. Azazel, who saw that, blocked the punch with his hand and then suddenly burst out laughing. Seeing that those two were about to fight Surzex, and the others immediately rushed towards them to control the matter. Tatsuya, who was looking at the scene from the sideline side, and said, "If I already didn't knew, I wouldn't believe that these people are the leaders of factions." He then picked up the glass of wine he had been drinking from and turned his head towards his partner and said, "You have it hard to deal with someone like that daily, Rosweiss." Rosweiss, whose face was flushed from drinking alcohol, looked at Tatsuya with a glass in her hand as well and said, with some tears in her eyes, "You said it, Tatsuya-sama. That old man is the worst. He keeps on working me to the bone and then insults Dai for being uptight. The worst of all, he keeps on harassing me by saying that I am single. You wa." Tatsuya, who saw the girl beside him crying, looked around to ask one of his teammates to comfort her, but found that they all were already gone and were talking with others. Seeing that, Tatsuya sighed and patted Rosweiss back and said, "Don't worry, everything will be fine. Calm down, calm down." He then took out a handkerchief and wiped her tears and then said, Now calm down and stop crying. If someone who is supposed to be your boyfriend in the future sees you in such a condition, don't you think that it will be bad?" Hearing that, Rosweiss immediately looked up with puffed eyes and a flushed face and looked around and said, "Huh, my boyfriend is in this place?" Tatsuya, who saw that, looked at her with a sweat drop and thought, "Well, alcohol really makes you honest with yourself." Tatsuya then said, "Who knows? Look around and see if someone of your type is here." Rosweiss then looked at the boys in the hall for a while and then with a defeated sigh said, "No, I don't like anyone here. They all have that air of stupidness and arrogance around them. Ugh, I will never find a boyfriend." And then placed her head on the table. Tatsuya just smiled wryly and said, "Well, don't fret too much. Here, let's drink." And motioned the waiter, who came near them and placed 2 new glasses of alcohol on their table and took back the empty glasses. Tatsuya and Rosweiss took their glasses and brought them to their mouths. Tatsuya was about to take a sip from his glass, but stopped when he saw Rosweiss immediately gulping it down and placed the glass back on the table with force and say, "More." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then moved his glass towards her. Rosweiss, who saw the glass, immediately took it from him and again gulped it down in one go. Tatsuya then said, "If only you were this open normally, you would not have been single." Rosweiss immediately looked at Tatsuya with narrowed eyes, but after looking at him for a while broke out crying and said, "Yuwa, now even you are saying that. I really am going to be single for the rest of my life." Tatsuya, who was surprised by Rosweiss' suddenly outburst, looked around and saw people looking at them, but when they all noticed Tatsuya's gaze, all of them immediately turned their heads and started to pretend that they didn't notice anything. Tatsuya looked back at the silver-haired girl sitting beside him, thought, "She have had too much alcohol that her thought process is now completely disturbed." Tatsuya then tried to comfort her, but seeing that normal talking was not working at all, he sighed, and was about to make her unconscious, but before he was able to, he felt someone coming towards him and turned his head. Tatsuya then saw Akino, who was wearing a black kimono, and smiled at her, and then glanced at Rosweiss. Akino looked a bit confused but glanced towards Rosweiss and understood that Tatsuya was asking for help. Akino then walked near Rosweiss and asked the situation from Tatsuya. After listening to everything, Akino chuckled, seeing which Tatsuya thought, "She is clearly going to make me regret asking her for help." Akino then looked at Rosweiss and with a kind smile on her face said, "Then Rosweiss-san, why don't we take it this way? If in future you are not able to find a boyfriend for yourself and have convinced yourself that you will not find one later as well, you can join us to be with Tatsuya. He is certainly the best choice for both day and night." And innocently looked towards Tatsuya, who on seeing her expression thought, "Yeah, I am not asking her for help in future." Chapter 187. Loki. After Akino was done helping Tatsuya, she looked at him with a smile and said, "See, wasn't I helpful?" Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then with a sigh said, Yeah, thank you. I will make sure to give you a punishment for your help." Akino then placed her hand on her cheek and with a blush on her face said, "Era, is that so? Then make sure to tie me up properly and tightly. Just tell me when you want to do the kinky stuff. I will gratefully accept my punishment." Tatsuya then looked at her with a dumbfounded expression and said, "Get your mind of the gutter. I was literally talking about a punishment. Sai, you really are Barrakiel's daughter without doubt." Hearing that, Akino frowned for a bit, but then leaned on Tatsuya and whispered in his ears, "But you still didn't deny about having that kind of punishment. Aren't you a naughty one as well?" And bit his ear. "Looks like it will be my duty to punish this naughty boy." Tatsuya then thought, "So now sadist is coming out. Let's send it back." Tatsuya then turned his head a bit and said, "You really need to know who is going to punish who," and used his telekinesis to pull Akino's nipples, making her immediately yelp in surprise, which soon turned into a feeling of pleasure. Tatsuya then took another glass of alcohol and gave one to Rosweiss as well, and once again both of them started drinking, ignoring Akino, who took a seat beside him as her legs got a bit wobbly because of the pleasure. She then looked at Tatsuya, who was talking with Rosweiss, who kept on spouting something because of being drunk. She stared at the two of them for a while and then lowered her head. Tatsuya, who noticed that, slightly shifted his gaze and thought that she got a bit jealous on seeing him talking to someone else. He was about to console her, but he heard her mumbling, "Teasing me when we are surrounded by all these people and now neglect play. HHH. I am getting hot." Tatsuya, who heard that, stopped his hand, which was approaching her, while his lips started twitching, and he thought, just like her father. Meanwhile, at another location of the hall, the leaders who were somehow able to stop the conflict between Azazel and Barakiel were now discussing some matters in between them. Barakiel, who was talking with Azazel and Surzex about the trading of Rias and her peerage, shifted his gaze to the surroundings and saw some of the people still glancing at him with disgust in their eyes. He clenched his fists and teeth and thought, just because of Azazel now all of them are looking at me with disgust. Not only that, some of them are even looking at me with passionate gazes as well. Ugh, control yourself, Barakiel. You have to protect your image as a cadre, which have already been destroyed, in front of the others. You cannot be as shameless as Azazel. Azazel, who was standing beside him, suddenly glanced at Barakiel and thought, he still have the guts to badmouth me. Surzex looked at Barakiel and said, so Barakiel-san, you don't have any problem in helping my sister's peerage training, right? Barakiel immediately snapped out of his thoughts and looked at Surzex with a serious expression and said, no problems from my end. My daughter is in her group as well. So then getting stronger will prevent my daughter from getting into dangers. So in a way you can say it is in my preference as well. After all, can spend some time with the devils. Yeah, it is important to get to know them better since we are having an alliance. Hearing that, suddenly Azazel smirked and said, ho ho, so you have a thing for the young ones as well. He then nodded his head sagely and said, the older you are the kinkier you get. Ha, Barakiel. Have some shame, my friend, your daughter will be in the group as well. And pretend to look a bit sad. Barakiel immediately widened his eyes and looked at Azazel and said, hey, what are you, spow dash? But before he can finish, a hand grabbed his shoulder with a bit of strength, making him turn his head in confusion. After turning his head, the sight that welcomed him was a Surzex with a menacing aura around him and a smile on his face. Barakiel-san, neither it is my duty nor do I care about your unusual preferences, but Surzex then tightened his grip and said in a cold voice, if you try to do something to Riatan or make her sad, I will make sure to make your life so fucked up that you will feel pain even if you have those fetish preferences. With his smile not disappearing even for a second, he then loosened his grip and moved his hands back and said, I hope that you understand, Barakiel-san. Barakiel, who was dumbfounded by the sudden, even was still surprised and subconsciously nodded his head. Surzex nodded his head as well and smiled, and then walked away to talk with Odin. Barakiel, who then got back to reality, then said, what happened just now? Azazel just smiled and then gave a thumbs up and said, good for you, my friend. You just got one more person to look down on you and think that you were some kind of shit. Now you can brag about it to your other impals. And then walked away while waving his hand and saying, I am happy for your success. Make sure to treat me later. And then stood beside Ajuka and started to discuss some technological stuff with him. After the leaders were done discussing the matters that they wanted to, Surzex gathered the attention of others, and once all of them were focusing on him, he have a speech about the factions and the disputes that they have been having for so long, and how they were going to have an alliance with the other factions. He then looked at Odin and said, Lord Odin, if you have no objections, then please dash, and motioned towards a crystal monument. Odin looked around the hall, and then his gaze fell on Rosweiss, who was talking and drinking along with Tatsuya and some other devils from Rias's and Sona's peerages, and then thought, looks like this won't be as bad as I thought. He then glanced at Azazel and then thought, besides the fallen brat know much more research institutes than me. I can make full use of that knowledge, and gave a sagely nod. He then looked back at Surzex and with a serious expression on his face said, very well, let's sign the alliance. Surzex then smiled and then led him towards the monument. Odin then moved his hand towards a panel which was in front of the monument, but before he was able to place his hand, a voice was heard by everyone in the hall. I object. Odin stopped his hand and with an annoyed sigh said, so you finally decided to mess things up, huh? Odin then turned around and suddenly a magic pattern appeared in the middle of the sky, and soon a man wearing white clothes with a pale skin and light blue hair appeared out of it and floated in the air with his hands crossed. The man then said, I am the evil god of trickery, Loki, and I have an objection with your decision, old man. Odin then said, Brad, if you go back right now, I will forgive you. The man snorted and then said, shut up, old shit. I don't want forgiveness from someone who is thinking of making an alliance with such weak factions. Rosweiss, who was drunk, stood up from her spot and said, hey hick, how dare you insult Lord Odin like that? While wobbling on her spot, Tatsuya, who was sitting beside her, pulled her back on the seat and said, you are still drunk, so calm yourself a bit, and looked back at Loki and said, oh, don't mind us, continue, and looked at him while taking a sip from his glass. All the people in the hall looked at him with a dumbfounded expression and were surprised on seeing him acting so casually in front of a god. The leaders of the factions just sighed and massaged their temples as they looked at Tatsuya, while Seraphal puffed her chest proudly. Loki, who saw how Tatsuya was acting, got pissed and pointed his finger at him and said, you, who the hell are you? Tatsuya then pointed his finger at himself and said, me? To which Loki nodded his head. Tatsuya then stood up and said, I am the man of culture, Tatsuya. Nice to meet you. Hearing that the others got surprised once again seeing him acting like that, and Loki narrowed his eyes and said, just a human and still acting like that? And why do I feel like I have heard your name? Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, who knows? Why not stop wasting your time and start doing what you came for? Loki snorted and said, don't tell me what to do. And then a magic circle appeared beneath him and 3 huge wolves appeared from it. Seeing them, the devils and the faction leaders got tensed and thought, Fenrir. Loki then pointed towards Tatsuya and said, tear him apart. Seeing that all the leaders face-palmed and said at the same time, well, he is fucked, and looked at Loki with pity. Tatsuya, who was drinking his fine, looked at the dogs, coming towards him with an unamused expression in his face. Seeing him like that, the dogs growled in anger and jumped on him. Just as they were about to approach him, a skeleton appeared around Tatsuya, Susanoo, and then the skeleton bitch slapped the dogs away, making them plastered in the walls. Tatsuya looked at Loki and said, done yet? Seeing his wolves plastered in the wall, Loki got shocked and then looked back at Tatsuya and after a while, as if he realized something, said, You are the human that the Cows Brigade have been talking about recently, right? Tatsuya smiled and said, oh, I didn't know that I have a fan club in the Cows Brigade as well. Seeing him acting as if nothing had happened, Loki's anger kept on rising, and unconsciously, he activated his divinity, making all the young devils shocked by the power that he was emitting. Loki then started charging his power for a big attack, seeing which Tatsuya said, I am not in the mood for that today. Can we do your ass whooping at a later date? Besides, this place is too small for such an attack. Except for the ones at the stage, the rest of them might even die. Loki smirked and said, do you think that I care for such things? If they die, they die. If they don't die, then I will kill them. Tatsuya sighed and then said, you know people die if they are killed. Loki then nodded his head and said, wise words. Tatsuya looked at him with a dumbfounded expression and then said, so you are going to kill them all? Loki nodded his head and said, yeah, I won't stop even if you beg for mercy now. This is important for Ragnarok. Tatsuya nodded his head as well and then said, then will you start with that person? And pointed his finger towards a direction. Seeing that all of them were surprised, Adi turned their heads where Tatsuya was pointing and only saw a wall there. Loki and the others then turned around and he then said, hey, there is nothing in that direct dash. But before he was able to finish, something hit his face and his body started to glow red. Seeing that, all were surprised as they saw a ball hit Loki's face. The top and bottom halves are divided by a horizontal black band. The top half of the ball is purple with a white letter M on the front, with a pink circle on either side, while the bottom part was colored white with a button just below the M on the black band. Basically, a master ball from Pokemon. The ball then opened up and shot a red light at Loki, who got covered in one as well, and was then sucked in the ball, which then closed and fell on the ground. The ball then shook thrice before a sound and a flash of light came from the ball. Tatsuya then simply moved his hand forward and pulled back the ball with telekinesis and said, well, I caught a god type. Chapter 188. Aftermath of the Peace Treaty. After Tatsuya got the ball in his hand, he simply stored it in his storage and then walked towards the dogs. The wolves who saw him coming towards them took a defensive stance and were growling at him. They had already tried to attack him once, and now they are not going to try that again. Tatsuya stopped on his spot once he was close enough, and then eyed the wolves from top to bottom. And after nodding his head, he moved his hand forward and pulled the wolves towards him. The wolves tried to resist and sunk their claws in the ground, but Tatsuya simply lifted their bodies so as to stop the futile resistance and continued to pull them. Once they were close, Tatsuya placed his hand on each of their heads one by one and tried to form a familiar contract with them. The wolves, who sensed what was happening, widened their eyes in surprise and then tried to look for Loki. Noticing that, Tatsuya said, if you are looking for Loki, that guy is already sealed by me, though I will use him later. So I would advise if you go with the flow and accept the offer. I am even ready to give a job to you 3. And I promise that you all will live a comfortable life, though you may have to fight from time to time. I guess it would still be a better life than the one you have been spending with Loki. The wolves who heard him were tempted but were still hesitating to accept, and seeing that, Tatsuya grinned and said, oh, if in the case you were not to accept, you would either be sealed or killed by the Norse faction, because you would be handed back to them, as technically you all are still their responsibilities. Hearing that, the wolves immediately allowed to form the contract with him, and a crest immediately formed on top of their heads. Tatsuya then smiled and used his magic to turn the 3 of them into small pups and said, now then, welcome to the group. To which the 3 pups gave a delighted bark. Tatsuya then turned his head towards Odin and said, you don't mind, right? Odin, who noticed his gaze, opened his mouth and was about to say something, but before he could even utter a word, Tatsuya said, you know, I was actually attacked by a god. Who knows how much damage could he have done to me, if I wasn't lucky? Who should I blame for his actions? Should I try to take actions against this? Hearing that, all the people who knew Tatsuya immediately thought, like hell were you lucky? It was that goddamn bitch of a god that was lucky that he didn't suffer and was simply sealed. Some people among them thought, he didn't even suffer the 3-way war. How dare you say that you were lucky? While this was happening, a certain black-haired and devil, whose most of the body was artificial, Diodora Astaroth, thought, heh, and that bitch was saying that he was a god and refused to take Ophus's power. Now see, he fell in demise, and that too at the hand of a human. Useless. Odin, who saw Tatsuya smile, showed a wry smile as well and then said, well, we would have sealed him away anyway, and like you said, we would have did the same things that you mentioned with those pups behind you. But they are my grandson and great-grandsons in a way, so I would be pleased if you take good care of them. And how about we discuss the matter about sealing after this event is over? Odin then thought, honestly, it is going to get me into a lot of trouble back at home, but it would still be better than to be in a conflict with him. Plus, it's not like they can oppose me. I can get Thor, Hela, and Freya to stand up for H as well. So not much of a problem there. Besides, the sooner we get this over with, the sooner me and the fallen brat can do our research. He then looked towards Azazel, who immediately noticed his gaze and nodded his head and said, Sirs X, let's continue with the treaty, and it is not like we can do anything about it anyway. The Norse faction itself has said that they have not a problem with it and none of our people are injured as well. Besides dash, he then slowly whispered, do you want to get on the brat's bad side? Hearing that, Sirs X gulped his saliva and nodded his head and said, Odin Dano, if you may, let's continue this treaty for the greater good of our factions. Odin nodded as well and said, yeah, for the greater good, and placed his hand on the panel, after which the audience started clapping their hands. After the party was over, all the leaders were assembled in the hall, and all of them were looking at Tatsuya, who was looking at all of them with a calm expression in his face. Thor was about to say something, but Tatsuya raised his hand to stop him and took out the ball from his storage, said, come out, and then the ball opened and a white light came out of it and Loki materialized beside him. Loki, who came out, looked at his surroundings and saw himself surrounded by all the leaders and immediately got into battle mode and used his magic. Seeing that, everyone got surprised and were ready to attack back, but nothing happened, making all of them, except for Tatsuya, look at Loki in confusion. What is happening? Why can't I use my magic? Loki said, and then looked at the Tatsuya who was sitting beside him and said, human, what did you do to me? Tatsuya just smiled and said, you can't use your powers without my permission also. In appreciation of our friendship, I just gave a little gift to you. See you wrist. And immediately, everyone looked at Loki's wrist, which had a small golden chain wrapped around it like a bracelet. Tatsuya then said, that gift of mine can suppress divinity. Do you like it? No need to thank me. Hearing that, the two gods in the room other than Loki widened their eyes and looked at the chain with shock. Loki, who heard Tatsuya's explanation, tried to break the bracelet, but was unable to even after using all his strength. Seeing that, Tatsuya said, Fufufu, you won't be able to break it that easily. Our power of friendship is very strong. Now go and rest for a while. And then moved the ball in his direction, and a red light fired towards Loki, and in the next instant Loki got sucked back into the ball. Tatsuya looked at Odin and Thor and then said, as you saw that he is still alive and kicking and is totally under my control, so any more problems on your side? Thor then rose his hand and said, what are you going to do with him? Tatsuya then started thinking and said, I haven't really thought about it. Well, most probably he will be doing odd jobs, like cleaning the restaurant, or working as a waiter. He can also take care of the pups, and if he works well, who knows, I can even make him take care of my new hotel that is still under construction. Or if he wants, I can even make him work in a host club if he prefers that. Well, on any note, he will not run around wild causing ruckus, so you can rest assured. Thor nodded his head and said, thank you a lot. I am glad that you are taking responsibility for his actions. However, he is still my brother and I care for him, even though he have tried to kill me on multiple occasions, or have set an ambush against me, or have made me sleep with a girl who have AIDS, or have turned a girl himself to seduce me and kill me while I was not looking. Sigh, I am surprised myself, how can he come up with that sort of thing? Tatsuya just showed a wry smile and said, well, look on the bright side. Your brother has a good strategizing brain. Azazel then said, well, if we have finished talking about Thor's love life, let's get this over with. A lot have happened today, and I want to rest up a bit. So shall we over the discussion? All of them looked at each other, and then all of them shrugged their shoulders and said at the same time, no problems, and then stood up from their chairs. Azazel then stretched his body and said, well, I am going to relieve some of my stress. You coming, old man? Odin then cursed his beard and said, is that even a question to ask? Of course I am coming. I will show you whose spear will dominate. Azazel grinned and said, heh, we will see, old man. And the two teleported away. Tatsuya then gave his farewells to the other leaders who teleported away after that, and then sighed. Let's go back, the others must be waiting for me. You three, let's go. While he called the puppies. Soon the three puppies came back, but on seeing them, Tatsuya's eyes twitched. The three puppies who had the powers to kill gods came in the room while dragging the silver-haired bodyguard of Odin, who was completely wasted because of alcohol. Chapter 189. Morning of Misunderstanding. After the youth devil meeting ended successfully, Tatsuya and the three pups along with another guest came back to the Gremory mansion. Tatsuya, who was simply carrying Rosweiss over his shoulder, went to the only room that he had been using and saw Millikas already sleeping in his bed. Tatsuya gave a yawn as well, and then used his magic and placed another bed beside the one already present in the room and laid Rosweiss on it. He then used his magic to change her clothes to a comfortable white night robe. He looked at the puppies and made a small comfy bed for them and said, I don't think that I need to remind you, but don't dirty the room and keep watch. If you notice someone with hostile motives, enter the room, then deal with them, but don't kill them. I would talk to them personally. The pups who heard Tatsuya's instructions gave a bark in approval, to which Tatsuya smiled, and then bent down to pat their heads. He had to admit that even if they are godslayers, currently they looked very cute and were very fluffy. He patted them for a while having a smile on his face on seeing the puppies having a pleasant expression on their faces. He then let go of them reluctantly and then changed his clothes to a half shirt and boxers and slept beside Millie-Cass. The next morning in a room in the Gremory mansion, a silver-haired lady who was sleeping started to wake up while having a frown on her face. The lady then groggily sat up while holding her head with her hands and muttered, "I am feeling that my head is about to burst." She then rubbed her eyes for a while, and once she was done she looked around her surroundings and said, "Where am I?" She then checked her body and was surprised on noticing the beautiful night robe that she was wearing and thought, "How come I am wearing something like this? It looks very expensive. There is no way that I will buy something like this." She then began inspecting the room more clearly and then thought, "This room looks exquisite as well. Seriously, where am I?" Her gaze then fell on the bed beside her and noticed a man and a child sleeping on it with the boy on top of the man. Seeing the man, the lady widened her eyes and said, "Huh, Tatsuya-sama." Tatsuya, who heard someone calling him, slowly opened his eyes with a frown on his face and then started rubbing them. His gaze then fell on the lady who was calling him and said, "Ah, Rossweiss, you are awake. Do you have a headache or something?" And then sat up slowly in order to not wake Millie-Cass up and put him beside him on the bed. Rossweiss looked at him and then waved her hands and said, No, I am fine, just a small headache, that's all. And more importantly, where are we and why am I wearing something like this? And who changed my clothes?" Tatsuya looked at the silver-haired Valkyrie being uneasy because of the sudden change in her surroundings, and with a neutral expression on his face said, "We are in Underworld. Last night the contract was signed, and now here we are spending our first night together. You know you were crazy last night. I couldn't believe a calm and collected woman like you could act like that. Seriously, I am totally surprised. You kept on going for so long that I am completely speechless." Hearing that, Rossweiss took some time to arrange the information that she just got, and immediately her face turned red and she said, "WW, what do you mean?" Tatsuya crossed his arms and nodded his head and said, "Yeah, we kept on doing that, and you were like, more. You seriously were something." Rossweiss' eyes started to get cloudy as fumes started to come out of her head, and she said, "Wait, wasn't this too soon to do that? And in the first place, why did you accepted the proposal so easily?" Tatsuya calmly looked at her and then said, "Like I said, I was tricked into it by you, and not only that, in order to seal the deal you made me do it with you as well. Honestly, it is me who should be complaining here, as I was the one who was taken advantage of." Rossweiss didn't know what to do now. If what Tatsuya was saying was true, she was the one who was at fault here. She took advantage of someone, and that was totally disgraceful for her as a Valkyrie. But despite it being disgraceful, she cannot say that she don't remember about it and just get away with it. She was a Valkyrie, and just as righteous as she is, she will take responsibility for her actions. She stood up from her head and walked towards Tatsuya and took his hands in hers and said, "Don't worry, Tatsuya-sama. No, husband, I promise that I will take responsibility for my actions. I am ready to take full responsibility for you, and is even ready to give birth to a healthy child and take care of it. You don't have to be troubled. I am a responsible woman and will not give you any chance to complain." She then looked at him with a small smile and then thought, "So the time for me to have a lover has come. Everyone who have been humiliating me for being single for all this time. I have just one thing that I want to say to you all. In your face, ass holes. Always saying that I will never have a lover because I am uptight and strict. Fuck OFF. I can now die peacefully." And just as she thought that, she felt a lot of killing intent and her body became completely stiff. She somehow turned her head and noticed a lot of attacks coming towards her, but was not able to do anything because of the killing intent aimed at her. Tatsuya, who noticed the attacks coming, simply looked towards them and all of them immediately disappeared. Tatsuya then noticed his group standing there with most of them releasing a black aura, while Kurumi was looking at them with an amused smile on her face and said, "Oh, this is going to be fun." Tatsuya, who looked at them for a while and then said, "What are you all doing? Why so enthusiastic in the morning?" Miyuki looked at Tatsuya with a smile and was about to say something, but Rossweiss suddenly said, "I knew it. The world cannot simply sit and watch my happiness. If this is the only way, then be it. I am not going to give up easily." Tatsuya looked at Rossweiss and was about to ask her about what she was talking about, but Miyuki then said, "Bitch, looks like you really want to die early. You have the guts to seduce Oni-sama and to even call her husband. I will make sure that you suffer greatly for your crime." Himari took a step forward as well and said, "I hate to agree, but this time I agree with Miyuki. I will burn your whole body." And a fireball appeared in her hands. Asia looked at her with an innocent smile and then said, "And I will punch the hell out of you with my heel punch so that we can kill you over and over again. I will make you spill out your guts, and then will dare you to swallow, then back to your body and repeat the process again. Oh, do worry, you will not die till I am satisfied." Tatsuya and everyone looked at Asia, who's smiling innocently, and thought at the same time, "That's totally disturbing. How can you say God with such an innocent expression on your face?" Tatsuya then clapped his hands and said, Can you explain what is going in here? And Kurumi, I am sure that this is a misunderstanding, and you know about it as well, so clear it right now." Kurumi chuckled and walked forward, earning a confused look from the others, and then sat in Tatsuya's lap and looked at Rossweiss and said, "Now, Rossen, why did you call him why Tatsuya? Husband?" Rossweiss, who saw Kurumi sitting on Tatsuya's lap, narrowed her eyes, said, "Isn't it only natural to call someone whom you have copulated with as husband?" To which Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Wait a minute, who said that I had sex with you?" The whole room fell in silence, and the only sound which was heard was coming from Kurumi, who was trying hard to not break out laughing. Rossweiss then said, "WW, what are you saying? Didn't you say that the contract was signed and we spent the first night? Tatsuya nodded and said, yeah, the contract for the alliance was signed yesterday, and we spent the first night as members of the alliance. All of them were then speechless and Kurumi broke out laughing. Hearing her laugh, Rosweiss came out of her stupor and said, and what about me forcing you to do it? And any getting crazy? And keep on going for very long? Tatsuya nodded and said, yeah, last night we started drinking. You went crazy after drinking and then forced me to drink with you as well, and you also kept on drinking for a long time, and when I asked you to stop you refused and kept on saying more and more. Tatsuya then looked at each of them and noticed the other girls walk towards Rosweiss and then consoling her. Kurumi, who was sitting on Tatsuya's lol, leaned on him and asked, you were doing it on purpose, weren't you? Tatsuya hugged Kurumi back and said, as expected, you already know? Tatsuya then said, well, if she is already this shocked, she might not be that much surprised by the news that I am going to tell her next. Kurumi thought for a while and then said, about her being left behind by Odin? And immediately Rosweiss moved from her spot and grabbed Kurumi's shoulders and said, wait. You are telling me that Lord Odin left me behind? Kurumi looked at her for a while and then simply nodded her head. Seeing that, Rosweiss stood motionless for a while and then took a deep breath and said, I have had enough of this shit. I quit working for him. All of them then thought, aren't you already fired? While Tatsuya thought, well, she looks fine. Chapter 190. Start of the training. After the whole misunderstanding was solved and Rosweiss was able to get over the shame, Tatsuya gave her some clothes to wear, as the clothes that she had when she came to the underworld were not very comfortable to wear casually. Both of them then changed their clothes, of course in different rooms, and then left the room after Tatsuya woke Milikas up. All of them then head towards the dining hall, and all of them took a seat. All of them were silently eating their food till Isami said, President, you are looking very troubled. Did something happen? All of them looked towards Isami, and then turned their heads towards Rias. Rias, who noticed their gazes, got a bit nervous and looked towards her mother. Venolana, who noticed her daughter's gaze, thought for a while, and then nodded her head, to which Rias nodded her head as well. Rias took a deep breath and said, last night, while we were at the meet, my father was attacked by someone at the place where he was staying. Though he don't have any physical injuries, Saya's mental condition is a bit unstable. Hearing that, all of them got surprised, or at least pretended to act surprised. Tatsuya then asked, is he still same or? Rias then waved her hands and said, no, he is not honed completely mad. He can still think properly, but still? Tatsuya looked a bit sad and said, sorry about that. Kurumi and his team looked at him, and then all of them gave a telepathic message to him at the same time. Are you really sorry? Tatsuya mentally sighed and then telepathically said to them, yeah, I am sorry that he is still sane. I wanted him to go completely mad, but it looks like he can still be normal after all that mental torture. I knew I should have used Tsukiyomi, three-way war versions. Hearing him, all of them looked at him with a deadpan look, and then Kurumi telepathically said, but if he somehow was able to overcome even that, and would have told others about that, then there was a chance that they might know that you were the Dark Reunion. Since only you have the guts to use something like that, and act like nothing is going wrong. Tatsuya nodded his head as well and said, I knew it, that's why I didn't us that, and I have promised Surzex that I will not kill him this time, so let's just think that he is just lucky enough to survive. All of them just nodded their heads, and decided to stop thinking about the topic. Tatsuya, who decided to change the topic, looked at the others and asked, by the way, are you guys going to start training for your raiding games today? Hearing that, all of them got a bit excited, and Rias started to tell the others that she have already asked someone to guide them in the training. While Rias was explaining the others, Tatsuya looked at Rosweiss sitting beside him and asked, and what have you decided to do? Take a vacation for a while? Rosweiss looked towards Tatsuya with a surprised expression and then thought for a while and said, well, since I am now free from all my work, I think that a short vacation might be nice. After that I will search for a new job, I guess. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, well, good for you. And if you are unable to find a job, then ask me. I might be able to help you get one. Rosweiss just smiled and nodded her head after hearing Tatsuya's proposal. Rias then looked at Tatsuya and his group and asked, so what are you guys planning to do? All of them then looked at Tatsuya's group and noticed that the girls other than Kurumi and Ingvild got stiff. Tatsuya looked towards Rias and said, oh, we will just make some visits here in Underworld, after which there is going to be the training session. They have to break through their current level after all. Hearing that, the girls showed a displeased expression while Ingvild and Kurumi just sighed, and both of them thought, I am so glad that I break through the Satan level earlier. I don't have to got through much hell this time. Both of them then looked at each other and gave an appreciative nod to each other. Ingvild and Kurumi then looked at their teammates and looked at them with a pity/mockery, as they will be having a hard time as all of them at the high ultimate class and will require a lot of effort to go beyond that, since breakthrough to the next stage, e.g. from high mid-class to low high class, is completely different compared to the breakthrough to the next level, e.g. from low high class to mid-high class. The others who noticed their gazes glared back at them, to which both of them smiled and said at the same time, let's work hard, guys. Hearing that, the others snorted and said, we will see both of you later. Don't get ahead, you two. Seeing the interaction between the group, the other people in the room were a bit confused, and Akino asked, why are you all freaking out so much? I mean, we will be training as well, right? Hearing that, all the girls in Tatsuya's group glared at her, making her flinch a bit, and Himari said, don't speak if you don't know what kind of hell we are going to go through. Don't act so tough, since you were able to somehow manage to stay alive after the training that you went through before the game with Phoenix. Your whole training was even easier than the warm-up that we will be having in our training camp. Seeing that the Gremory group except for Zenobia, who don't know about the training that they went through before the game with Phoenix, were a bit shocked, and Akino said, Now, don't exaggerate so much. No, it is not exaggeration. All of them turned towards the one who said that and saw Isami looking at them seriously and said, I know that it is not an exaggeration. I have seen with my own eyes what kind of training they go through. So I know what will happen if he is going to dedicate himself in training them. She looked at the girls and said, just try to stay alive. The girls from Tatsuya's group who saw their junior from the Gremory team encouraging them felt a bit moved and smiled and nodded their heads. Tatsuya, who saw the interaction between them, nodded his head and said, fine. Isami, you are going to be in the camp as well? Isami, who heard Tatsuya, felt like her whole world shattered and looked at the others with pleading eyes. She looked at Tatsuya and said, Now, I don't want to trouble you all while you are training them. Tatsuya, who heard that, just smiled at her and said, pack your things. Isami, who heard that, now knew that all the hope for her was gone and simply lowered her in disappointment. The girls from the group looked at Isami and said at the same time, just try to stay alive. To which Isami just twitched her lips. After all of them were prepared for their training, they went to a room and saw Azazel sitting in the room. Azazel, who saw Tatsuya, nodded his head, to which Tatsuya nodded his head as well and said, so, you brought the things that I asked for? Azazel nodded and then said, yeah, I have them with me. Just bring the boy here and I will install them in him. Tatsuya nodded and then took a seat. Azazel then started to explain the training to the members of the Gremory group, and while he was doing that, Isami was looking at them with jealousy. Once they were done, Tatsuya said, Kaneko will be coming with me. I have already contacted someone who will be able to help her with her senjutsu. Kaneko looked at Tatsuya, to which Tatsuya just winked at her, and she understood who will be the one training her and readily agreed with him. Once they were all done, Tatsuya stood up and gave a piece of paper to Rias, making her a bit confused. Seeing which, Tatsuya said, there are some physical training methods written in it. It would be great if you could become a bit more durable. Focus more on it, as you should know that you are not the type who depends on strategy. Rias looked at Tatsuya with an offended look, but still nodded her head in approval. She knew that what Tatsuya was saying was true, but accepting it was difficult. But still, she was not going to ignore what Tatsuya said because she had already done so in the previous training session, and the results were not that good. Tatsuya then talked to the others for a while before all of them departed for their training. Tatsuya then teleported to the Citri house and appeared in the room where Sona was talking with her peerage. All of them were shocked on seeing that someone appeared in the room and took a battle stance, but relaxed once they saw that Tatsuya was the one who came. Tatsuya then looked at the group and noticed Saji and grabbed his shoulder and looked towards Sona and said, I will be taking Saji with me. Don't bother looking for him as he is going to be working under me. Bye. Love you, and teleported back. All of them blinked their eyes in surprise, and Sona looked at her peerage and asked, did he take my peerage member without my permission once again? All of them looked at each other and just shrugged their shoulders. Sona narrowed her eyes and said, he is going to get it from me once he returns back. Just hope that he doesn't get him injured. Tsubaki shifted her glasses and said, yeah, look like I have to do something about it. She then looked at Sona and said, don't worry, Sona. I will make sure that he is punished properly for this. Just leave all this to me. Sona looked towards Tsubaki for a while and then said, you are planning on doing it with him alone, right? Like hell, I am going to give you a chance. To which Tsubaki just clicked her tongue and looked away. Chapter 191. Saji's Determination. Tatsuya, who took Saji along with him, teleported back to Gremory Mansion. Saji, who was still confused about what happened, looked in his surroundings and then looked towards Tatsuya. And Nikki? Where are we? Tatsuya looked at Saji and said, we are in the Gremory Mansion. Now follow me. Saji just nodded and followed Tatsuya while looking around the mansion. Tatsuya then entered the room where everyone was present earlier and said, I brought him. Now to your work, Azazel. Saji entered behind Tatsuya and looked at the people still present inside the room. Azazel looked towards the blonde following Tatsuya and said, oh, already done. Fine, Vritra boy, come here. Saji looked towards Azazel and then looked at Tatsuya, who nodded his head, to which Saji nodded in response as well and got closer to Azazel. Azazel then took out a device from his pocket and checked Saji's body with it and said, okay, no problem with you physically. Now bring out your sacred gear. Saji just followed his instruction and took out the absorption line which appeared on his hand. Azazel looked at the sacred gear and nodded his head with a smile and said, good. Now don't move, I will put it in you. It might hurt in the beginning, but trust me, you will feel a lot better once it is done. Hearing that, all of them looked at Azazel with a weird look on their faces, and Saji immediately jumped away from him and pointed his sacred gear at him and said, hold it. What the hell are you trying to do to me, you creep? Azazel looked at him with a confused expression on his face and said, what? Don't tell me that Tatsuya didn't tell you. He was the one who asked me to do it. He said that it will be beneficial for you. Saji looked at Tatsuya with a pleading expression on his face and said, Aniki, I know that you helped me want to lose my virginity, and I am glad that you were trying to help me as well, but no way in hell I am going to do something like this. Tatsuya just sighed and punched Azazel in the gut and said, don't say things in a weird way, pervert. He then looked at Saji and said, what he means is that I told him to put the remaining sacred gears of the Vritra series in you, so that you can become more powerful. Tatsuya then thought, after all, I want someone who can fight at Isami's level with her. Saji, who heard him, came to realization, Aniki, to think that you will do so much for me. I am so happy to hear that. I heard this from President that those who have a dragon-type sacred gear tend to attract members of the opposite sex, so you were trying to help me get powerful and get laid at the same time. As expected of Aniki, Saji said while looking at Tatsuya with shining eyes. Tatsuya, who heard Saji's reasoning, was left speechless, as the case was the same for the rest of the people in the room except for Azazel, who was showing a thumbs up to Saji and thought, because of that same reason I decided to make a dragon-type sacred gear for myself. Looks like Tatsuya has done deep research in these types of things as well. It's decided as his senpai I will give him my greatest masterpiece, The Road of Becoming a True Man of Culture. I haven't even published that book yet. Feel grateful, Tatsuya shouted. Make sure to reach the zenith for all the fellow men of culture as well. And looked at Tatsuya with a proud expression on his face. Tatsuya, who heard everything with his telepathy, looked at Azazel with a dumbfounded look on his face and thought, I really want to know how the hell a man like him is the leader of a faction. Tatsuya looked at Saji and said, Don't worry, you are my friend, right? Even though I just wanted to use you as a partner for Isami, might as well train you. You will be a good guard for Sona and Tsubaki. Saji tears up a bit and said, Aniki, I am so glad to have followed you. Don't worry, Aniki, I won't disappoint you. I will be strong enough so that I don't cause you any shame as your right-hand man. Tatsuya nodded and patted on his shoulder and said, Good. You have determination. Fine. I have decided that I will train you as well. Saji looked at Tatsuya with determination and nodded his head and thought, Aniki himself is going to train me. I can't let him down. He is expecting great things from me. Hiya. Fine, I will give my 100, no 200%. While Saji was thinking this, he felt a hand on his shoulder and turned his head to see Isami looking at him. Saji, as your senpai in training, I want to give you an advice. While you are training, never lose your hope to live if you want to survive. And walked away, leaving a completely stunned Saji. Saji, who was confused by Isami's threat, looked towards her and said, Wait, what do you owe me? But before he was able to finish, Tatsuya took 3 violet glowing orbs and shoved them inside Saji's chest, making him scream in pain, though there was no physical wound on his body. Tatsuya looked at Saji and said, You can do it, Saji. Don't lose hope. Endure this much. Just think how many girls will come at you once you have 4 dragon-type sacred gears. Hearing that, Saji's eyes widened and he said, Ha, no pain, no gain, right? Fine, then come at me with the worst you can sacred gear. I will not lose to you. For my bed to be filled with girls, and for Aniki, who is placing so much hope in me, I won't back down. And held his body from falling down with a completely new determination in him. All the people in the room were complete shocked to see the degree of determination in him and nodded their heads in appreciation, while Azazel looked at Saji and said, Ah, he is just like me when I first fell from the heaven. Ah, those were the days. All the girls around me couldn't stop but wet themselves once they had a taste of me. Happy memories. But just as he said that, Tatsuya used his telekinesis and threw him out of the window and said, I seriously doubt him as the governor of the fallen angels. After Tatsuya was done merging the sacred gears with Saji's soul, he let him rest for a while as he was totally breathless after that and fell down on the floor. He laid him down on the sofa and told the others to take their luggage with them as they were going to depart soon. Azazel then left the children alone as he still had to work. Unfortunately, him being the Governor General of the Fallen Angels was still a fact, and naturally work comes with his position. After an hour, all of them were present in the living room with their luggage, as well, and in addition to the children, Rosweiss, Grafia, Venilana, and Milikas were accompanying them as well. Rosweiss looked at the group hesitantly and asked, Is it really fine for me to tag along with you all? Tatsuya looked at her and said, Believe me, I am someone who doesn't like his HQ to be filled with strangers, but the fact that we will literally be leaving you behind here because even Grafia, Venilana, and Milikas are tagging along, then the only people left behind will be the servants of the Gremory Mansion whom you do not know at all, so it is your choice if you want to follow us or not. But make sure if you are coming, then you are not going to speak even a word about my place to anyone. Rosweiss thought about it for a while and then said, Fine, I won't tell a single soul about it. The fact that someone who I just met is treating me better than my own boss who left me behind is way too touching for me. All of them looked at her with pity in their eyes, making her tear up a bit. Seeing that, some of the girls went to her and consoled her to make her stop crying. Saji came closer to Tatsuya and whispered, I am starting to doubt whether she is truly an adult or not. Tatsuya sighed and said, Her boss had harassed her a bit too much. It is only natural for her. Tatsuya then clapped his hands and said, Anyway, let's keep that aside and go. Out, final member has arrived. Just as Tatsuya said that, a black cat jumped from the window into Tatsuya's arm, who caught the cat, and immediately it transformed into Kuroka. Kuroka hugged Tatsuya and said, Tatsuya, long time no seen ya. Tatsuya just patted her head and said, Yeah, happy to see you, Kuroka. Kuroka nodded and started snuggling to him, but was soon stopped by Kaneko, who grabbed her sister's tail and pulled it, making her groan in uneasiness. Kaneko looked at her sister coldly and said, Wani-sama, stop disturbing Tana. Kuroka looked at her sister, who was looking coldly at her, and hugged Tatsuya tightly and said, Look, Tatsuya, Chiron is bullying me, nya. Which only made Kaneko more pissed, and she immediately grabbed Kuroka's legs and pulled him out of Tatsuya's embrace. Tatsuya then gave a fake cough and said, Anyway, let's get going. And then snapped his fingers, and immediately a magic circle appeared below all of them, and immediately all of them teleported from the living room. Chapter 192, Tatsuya's Dimension. Just as Tatsuya and the others disappeared from the Gremory Mansion, a magic circle appeared in Tatsuya's dimension and all of them appeared from it. The people who just appeared there along with the three dogs looked around their surroundings and were impressed with the location they were at. Tatsuya's group looked around and then said, "You really have changed the whole thing here, huh?" Hearing that, every one of them looked towards Tatsuya and all got completely speechless. Saji pointed at Tatsuya and said, "Aniki, how did you get older so suddenly?" Tatsuya looked at all of them with a calm expression on his face and said, "Don't make too much fuss. It's just that in this dimension you will not be able to hide your true appearance from others, till I do it for the person, of course. See, you all have turned back to your original appearances as well." Hearing that, all of them looked at each other and saw all the young members of Tatsuya's group to be in their grown-up appearance who looked to be around their early 20s. Seeing them, the others were completely shocked and had their mouth open wide. Isami pointed her finger at the girls who just had a wry smile on their faces and said, "You guys were older than me?" The girls just gave a dry laugh and shook their heads and said, "This is the effect of training so long in the time chamber. Our bodies did grow in that time. You have only trained there for a bit, that's why you have not grown like us." Hearing that, Rossweiss got interested in the time chamber and asked, "Hey, by time chamber do you mean a room with time dilation spell, so as to give a proper effect to the area according to your liking?" Hearing the question, none of them answered, and just looked at her with a small smile on their faces. Seeing that smile, Rossweiss was a bit confused, and then Tatsuya placed a hand on his shoulder, making her turn her face towards him, and said, immediately blushing, seeing his face close to hers, as currently Tatsuya was close to her age, and was looking much more mature compared to his previous look, which was also accompanied with a small smile on his face. "Sorry, Rossweiss, but that is our trade secret, so you should be able to understand what I mean to say, right?" Rossweiss, who was still flustered by being so close to Tatsuya, heard his answer, and nodded her head and said, "Yes, you understand, sorry about that." Tatsuya's smile just widened a bit, and he said, "Thank you for understanding." And Rossweiss' blush immediately deepened. The other girls who saw this were a bit jealous of Rossweiss' position, as even from the location they were standing, Tatsuya looked charming, and they could without a doubt imagine Rossweiss currently being in heaven. While Milikas was looking at Saji with a weird expression on his face, as in front of him the high schooler had taken out a notebook out of nowhere, and was writing all the info he could get while learning under Tatsuya about picking up girls. Tatsuya then noticed someone coming towards them and turned around and said, "So they noticed us, huh?" And immediately a magic circle appeared and two girls, one with red and the other with light blue hair, appeared from it. Both the girls were surprised as well on seeing Tatsuya in his mature form, and were in daze for a while but soon got back to their senses and asked about what happened to him. After all explanation was done, Tatsuya looked at his group and said, "Let's get going, we have already wasted a lot of time here," and was about to teleport but stopped once Milikas asked about looking around the place. Seeing the excited expression on the young Gremory's face, Tatsuya sighed and nodded his head, looked towards his three dogs, and gave them a telepathic message. The dogs nodded their heads and a magic circle appeared over them and immediately changed to their actual form, but this time they showed no hostility at all. All of them then got on top of the wolves, and immediately after all were settled, the wolves started running, with Tatsuya's wolf being in the front with Milikas and Saji sitting along with him. Tatsuya then used his magic to allow the wolves to be able to float, and immediately the wolves started running in the sky. Milikas, who was sitting on front of Tatsuya, was looking at his surroundings with an excited expression on his face, and kept on asking questions from Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who was the creator of the dimension, explained about each and every facility that he had installed here, and was feeling a bit proud of his creation and was happy as well. The then guided the wolves to the center, and then slowly the wolves started deck-ending. Once all of them got on the ground, the wolves turned back to their small form and gave a bark. Tatsuya then bent down and ruffled the pups for a bit, appreciating their hard work, and then led the others in the huge mansion in front of him. After all were done settling down, Tatsuya gathered every trainee and said, "Fine then. All of you ready or not? I don't care, get ready for some hellish hard work." Hearing that, all of them tensed up a bit except for Saji, who was full with determination. Tatsuya looked at all of them from head to toe and nodded his head and said, "Go and get your swimsuits. We are going to the beach." All the girls who were waiting for some bone-breaking workout were left completely speechless by Tatsuya's words and took some time to register what he just said. Tatsuya then looked at the people who he was not going to train and said, "If you guys want to go there as well, you all are most welcome to, and Kuroka, I don't think that I need to tell you why you have been called here for, right?" Kuroka just nodded her head and pulled Kaneko in her embrace and said, "Yup, I have always wanted to train Chiron, yeah, and have some sister time with her, yeah." She then looked at Kaneko with a smile, seeing which Kaneko got a bit embarrassed by the sudden affection from her sister and looked down, though she felt very happy from inside and her ears and tails appeared. Kuroka then looked towards Tatsuya and said, "And of course to make kitties with Tatsuya, yeah." And immediately the happy feeling inside started to turn dark, and she looked towards her sister with a cold expression on her face. Kuroka, who felt a sudden killing intent, jumped back, barely missing a fist coming towards her gut from Kaneko's direction. Kaneko, who saw her attack miss, clicked her tongue and said, "Wani-sama, we will be training in combat as well, right?" With a smile on her face while cracking her knuckles. Seeing that, all of them took a step back from the wit-haired lowly and gulped their saliva. Tatsuya moved towards her and petted her head and said, Now, don't be rude to others." And immediately her expression melted into a blissful smile and she started purring on Tatsuya's caressing. The others who noticed the sudden change in her expression were left speechless, while her sister was depressed and was murmuring, "Chiron hates Wani-chan, yeah." Chapter 193, Training begins. After all the commotion was over, everyone immediately rushed to get their swimsuit. Once they were done, Tatsuya used his magic, and immediately a magic circle appeared under them, and all of them vanished from the mansion, only to immediately appear near the shore of the ocean. Tatsuya then snapped his fingers, and immediately a lot of beach chairs appeared on the beach. Tatsuya then looked at his trainees and said, "Keep your stuff and change." All of them nodded, and Tatsuya set up a tent for the girls to change into their swimsuits. Tatsuya then set up another tent for the boys, and went together with Saji and Milikast to change. Once they were done, all of them came out together, and both Saji and Tatsuya were completely awestruck by the girls in their swimsuits, but both of them soon snapped out of it as Tatsuya have already seen them naked or half-naked a lot of times, while Saji knew that the girls were his Aniki's lovers and didn't dare to give a lustful glance to them. Tatsuya then complimented the girls for their swimsuits, to which they all just smiled at him with a slight blush on their cheeks. Tatsuya then called his trainees to his side and gave them something like a wristband to wear. All of them were confused for a bit, but soon shrugged their shoulders and put them on their wrists. Tatsuya nodded and said, "Now push the button on the wristband." All of them nodded and then noticed a button on it and simply pushed the button. Tatsuya just smiled, sending a shiver down the smile of the girls while Saji was still fired up. Tatsuya then walked away and said, "You can do as you please." Hearing that, all of them blinked their eyes in surprise for a while, but soon a happy smile appeared on the faces of the girls while Saji had a slightly disappointed look on his face. "I knew it. Oni-sama is not a person who will waste our summer vacation on training. Yeah, I agree with you. I thought that he will make his work to our bone for our whole summer vacation in the name of training. But still, it is unthinkable that Tatsuya would let us off the training so easily. Now don't say something like that about Tatsuya. He is a great guy. Leaving that aside, let's go and play in the ocean." All of them gave a shout of excitement as well, and then started running towards the ocean. But just after all of them took a step, all of them felt huge amount of pressure on their bodies, which made them unable to move. All of them became shocked by that, but soon the girls realized something and turned their face towards the wristband and noticed that there was a slight glow in it. Tatsuya then came towards them with a smile on his face, followed by Tiamat and Ruya. The girls who saw Tatsuya wanted to glare at him, but were not able to because of the enormous pressure on their bodies, but still all of them thought, "Fuck you." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Yeah, I am planning to do the same at night. But for now, let's talk about the training." Tatsuya then pointed at the wristbands and said, "This must have been pretty obvious, but all of you must be feeling pretty weak and a lot of pressure on your bodies, right? This is because of the thing that you wore. It got activated after 30 seconds you switched it on." Tatsuya then waited for them to understand what all is going through their bodies and then said, "Now, how will you be able to move? Simple. The band on your wrists is just simply making an area in and around your bodies which increase the energy consumption. Simply meaning you will require to use a lot of energy just for a simple task. Even moving your eyelids must be difficult right now. So you just need to use much more energy to strengthen your body, or simply if you have the guts, raise your aura enough to destroy those wristbands by overloading them. Anyway, in simple terms, use as much energy as possible to move." Tatsuya then started walking away before soon turning around and said, "Oh, and it is advisable by me to not simply remain standing there. The sun is very bright here, and you all without sunscreen. If you don't want to get sunburnt, just start moving." Hearing that, all of them were shocked, but the girls were literally panicking from the news. Tatsuya then pointed towards a direction and said, "After 10 kilometers, there is some sunscreen placed on the table there, but I don't know if there is enough for everyone there or not." And once again, all of them got shocked and looked at each other warily. Tatsuya was about to go back to let them try to simply move their hands, but stopped and said, "Oh, how can I forget about some motivation for you guys? To work hard." All the motionless trainees became immediately attentive, thinking that he was about to promise some reward to them, and looked at Tatsuya expectantly. Tatsuya turned towards the two dragon accompanying him and said, "Take off their sandals and heat up the sand." And immediately all the motionless people became pale. The people who were training under Tatsuya from before immediately strengthened their bodies to the maximum they could, but at best they could only squirm around a bit. Tatsuya has set the limits very high for them, as he already knew how capable all of them actually were. Though, Saji's and Isami's bands give a lot less pressure compared to the others, but still for their bodies it was still too much. The dragons simply shrugged their shoulder and walked towards the squirming dummies and started taking off the sandal. Tiamat, when came closer to Kurumi, looked at her for a while, but soon a smirk appeared on her face which immediately enraged her, and she tried to kick Tiamat, but it was to no avail. Tatsuya just laughed at her and took the sandals off Kurumi's feet and started heating up the sand near her feet, earning a deadly glare from the said person, but in response Tiamat only gave a mocking smile. Seeing what was going to happen, Miyuki and Ingvile tried to use their water and ice magic to cool down the air near them or form a barrier of sorts around them, but nothing happened. Both of them continued to try pitifully, but all their efforts resulted in nothing. Tatsuya noticed their futile attempts and saw the other trying something like that as well, but still nothing happened. Tatsuya chuckled and said, "Magic won't work, those band block everything. Your only options are either to strengthen your body and move with brute force or pass enough energy to the bands to relieve a bit of the resistance that it is causing." All of them looked at him hatefully for a while, but soon looked towards their goal and decided to persevere through this. They were used to his hellish methods, and it was just one of them. They can overcome it just like they did in the past. It's just that this time, their bodies were not as powerful as before, and they could actually feel the heat rising near their feet. Soon Kurumi's legs moved a bit, causing the other girls to believe that this was possible. Kurumi then started moving slowly towards the direction of the sunscreen while she was gritting her teeth. Soon Wild and the others started moving as well, and now the only one who was left standing was Saji, who was looking at Tatsuya with a panicked expression on his face. Tatsuya looked towards Saji with a smile on his face and said, "Do your best," and walked away. Saji gritted his teeth and thought, "Fuck. I cannot remain left behind by others. My pride as a Niki's right Handan is at sake. My future with beautiful girls all over my bed is at sake. My dream of towards an erotic future is at sake. I cannot remain here." Saji pushed past your limits. Plus you Ra, and pushed all the power he had in his body immediately to the band, and his body immediately became light, and he started to run, but after a few steps he fell on the ground and his body became stiff again. Tatsuya looked towards his underling from a distance and said, "If you use up all your energy at once, then you will not have any energy to give to the band, you idiot. How are you going to move without any energy?" The other people who were not training under him give Saji and the girls a pitiful look and now knew why they feared Tatsuya's training. Kuroka, who was training Kaneko on the side, looked at the girls and thought, "I am so glad that I am not in his team." Kaneko looked at her sister and said, "For the first time in a while I thought that having a sister like you is great. I don't know what would have happened to me if she was like Tatsuya-senpai." Kuroka immediately puffed her chest, making her breasts jiggle a bit, making Kaneko look down at her own chest and become depressed. She then patted her chest and then said, "I am not small, I am just growing." Chapter 194, Saji's Special Training. Tatsuya continued to look at Saji for a while, and then sighed and said, "Looks like it cannot be helped." He then walked towards him and moved his hands towards his direction and started transferring some of his energy to his body. After confirming that he had given enough energy to Saji, he said, "This is the only time that you are going to get a refill. Now get and move your ass." Saji, who was lying on the ground completely motionless, internally nodded his head and thanked Tatsuya for this chance. He then closed his eyes to concentrate better and slowly started to send the energy to the wristband, and once he found a certain limit was enough, his body twitched a bit. Noticing that he found the correct limit, he got excited, and in the next moment his body became stiff once again. Tatsuya, who noticed this, said, "Don't lose your focus. You need to control your demonic energy efficiently if you want to move." Tatsuya continued to look at Saji for a while, but seeing that he was still unable to move, he sighed and thought, "Looks like this level of training is still difficult for him." He then used his telekinesis and lifted up Saji's body, making him confused for a moment. Tatsuya then removed his wristband, and immediately the stiffness and pressure around his body disappeared. Saji immediately started moving his limbs in order to feel them and sighed in happiness that he was once again able to move. While he was thinking this, Tatsuya said, "Looks like we have to start with something easier for you. This one is too much difficult for someone who don't have a clear grasp at his energy." He then flew up in the air while dragging Saji with him through his telekinesis, and after making sure that they were quite up in the air, he stopped and moved towards the ocean. After flying for a while, he stopped and looked down and nodded his head. Tatsuya then said, "Take out your wings." To which Saji nodded, and immediately a pair of black bag-like wings appeared behind him. Tatsuya then stopped using telekinesis on him, but instead formed a transparent energy field around him. Tatsuya then asked, "You do know how to make shields and barriers with your demonic energy, right?" Saji nodded his head and said, "Yes. President taught all of us from the student council for our own self-defense." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Good, now make the strongest barrier or shield, whatever you think you are better at. From here many attacks will aimed at you, but don't worry, all those attacks will at best will hurt like an average adult human's punch." Saji took some time to take in the information and then nodded his head and took a stance to get ready. Tatsuya nodded and said, "Good. You are allowed to dodge them as well, but the condition is that you will have to be inside the energy field the moment you pass, or even touch the field you will suffer from a very strong electric shock capable of killing a human." Hearing that, Saji gulped his saliva, but still nodded his head, although there was a slight hesitation in him. Tatsuya smiled at him and said, "Good. Now show me your determination," and snapped his fingers, and immediately a lot of magic circles surrounded Saji, making him just gasp at the sheer number of magic circles around him. Tatsuya then flew back a bit, and then said, "So let's begin." Saji nodded and narrowed his eyes and was looking around attentively. He had decided to use shields instead of barriers, as his barriers were relatively weaker compared to his shields, and technically shield took much less energy compared to a barrier. Saji then moved his hands forwards, and a blue magic circle appeared in front of his hands with a diameter of 1 meter. He then looked towards Tatsuya and motioned him that he was ready. Tatsuya nodded his head with a smile on his face and said, "So let's begin. 3, 2, 1. Oh, an important point I forgot to mention." Saji, who was looking around with a tensed face, immediately became limp and looked towards Tatsuya with a bit of anger in his gaze, which Tatsuya just ignored and said, "Just remember that there are no other rules other than the two mentioned before, so anything can happen." Saji looked at him with a confused expression for a while, not understanding what he was meaning to say, but still nodded his head. Tatsuya nodded and said, 3, 2, 1, go. And immediately the circle started glowing and started firing at Saji. Saji, who noticed the circles glowing, immediately took his stance and blocked the first attack coming towards him, but was completely shocked by the outcome. The attack not only was transparent and was very hard to see, but the fact that just one attack completely destroyed his shield was there as well, but still this was still expected from Tatsuya, who was training them like monsters, The fact that completely shocked him was, "Aniki, what was that? Do you want to crush my dick?" The attack was literally aimed at his dick. Tatsuya just smiled at him and said, "Survive for your would-to-be children," making Saji completely shocked, but soon he get out of the shock and dodged another attack which was once again aimed at his dick. Saji then understood what Tatsuya meant by anything can happen and gulped his saliva. He then blocked another attack with the shield in his second hand, which was once again destroyed in one hit. Seeing that Saji understood that his shields stand no chance here, and he have to continuously make shields, Tatsuya then said, "Yeah, that's right. You have to make sure that you use your demonic energy efficiently. No matter how strong the shield you make, they will be immediately destroyed, but if you make shields weaker than the attack, then they will not only break the shield but will hit you as well. Manage efficiently because not even I want to run out of energy in that place." Saji, who heard him, started panicking, and he immediately tried to argue with him, but stopped on seeing multiple attacks coming towards him. Dodging them, he tried to run away and pass through the barrier, but before he was about to touch the barrier, Tatsuya said, "About the electric shock from the energy field. Do remember the electricity will attack on your dick as well." And immediately Saji stopped and turned around, getting hit on the back. Since he turned around, he started to question whether Tatsuya held a grudge against him and is torturing him instead of training, and hearing that Tatsuya said, "Don't doubt me, it is legit training. By this, not only you will be able to use your demonic power efficiently, your demonic power will grow as well, and the same is true for your reflexes. And if by chance you were to get hit, which you most probably will be, your endurance will raise as well. Just think of this as tough love." Saji, who heard that, understood what Tatsuya meant with this training, but still he felt a bit sour about this. Tatsuya then said, "Have your determination for your future surrounded by beauties faded away? Wasn't it you who said that you will do anything for that? Don't lose hope. Give your best. Break through your limits. All this will pain only in the beginning, but the results will be much greater. All this is for the greater good." Saji, who heard him, got reminded of his dream, and his fire of determination rekindled in him, and he thought, "I was an idiot like hell. Aniki will torture me. He is doing all this just for me. I cannot fall back here. I will show him that my determination is not weak. I will show him that I can get stating. I will show the whole world that Saji Jinshiro will be the greatest, after Aniki." And just as he thought that, an attack hit his dick, making him immediately crouch down and groan in pain, and somehow by the will of the gods, author's authority, he touched the energy field, and let's just say his brother will not be standing up for quite some time. And all this made Saji unconsciously with smoke coming out of his body. Chapter 195, Planning for the Night Raid. After hours of hellish training for Tatsuya's training and enjoyment for the others, all of them gathered together at a spot with all the girls from Tatsuya's group completely skin burnt, along with swollen feet, and Saji standing in a weird posture, like how Sonic from One Punch Man was, after his balls crashed into Saitama's fist. Tatsuya looked at all of them for a while, and then sighed and used his magic to heal all of them, and then removed their bands, and immediately all of them fell down on the sand and were still motionless. Tatsuya looked at the girls for a while, and then looked towards the pups who were completely covered in sand and said, "Carry them all." The pups gave a bark and then transformed into Tiafair original size and shook off all the sand on their bodies. Tatsuya then used his telekinesis and put all of them on their back, and then looked at Saji, but before he could place him up there, he raised his hand and stopped Tatsuya from saying anything and said, "I would prefer to walk on my own. I cannot handle the shocks I will receive while being on their backs in the condition I am in." Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Do as you wish, but be prepared, tomorrow would be much difficult." Saji just nodded his head and took out his wings and floated in the air so as to not get any jerks from walking. Milicast looked towards Saji for a while and then said, "He will have problem while peeing." Both Saji and Tatsuya looked towards the young Gremory, and Tatsuya just ruffled his hair. Both him and Saji then thought at the same time, peeing should be the least of his / my worries, right now. His / my children's future is at stake here. Tatsuya just cleaned his body fan, changed his clothes, and returned back to the mansion with everyone else. Tatsuya then ordered the wolves to place the exhausted girls in their room, and then himself went in the kitchen. Saji excused himself, and then went to his room to rest and recover. The other guests looked at each other for a while, and then Kuroka said, "Well, I'm going to help Tatsuya," and simply slipped away from the group and went towards the kitchen. Kaneko wanted to stop her sister or go with her as well, but unfortunately, she didn't know how to cook and just sat on the couch and took out some sweets and switched on the TV, seeing which Milicast sat beside her, as well as he rarely gets the chance to do so at his home in Underworld, as he is usually busy with his tutors. Venolana as well sat beside her grandson, while Grafia decided to help Tatsuya in the kitchen, since despite being on vacation, her instinct as a maid made her restless on seeing that someone else was working for her, and even Tatsuya at that. As a maid, it was unacceptable to her to let the one she would be serving was cooking for her, and decided to somehow convince him to let her do the work. Rossweiss I was a bit confused about what to do, looked at the two women beside her and asked, "So Tiamat-sama, I have heard that you have a hobby of collecting a lot of treasures. Would you mind showing some to me?" Hearing that someone beside her had an interest in her treasures, Tiamat smiled proudly and said, "Fu. Well, if you want to see them so badly, then I guess I can show some of them to you. You coming as well, Ruya?" Ruya just waved her hand in denial and sat beside Kaneko and took a pack of sweets from her without her permission, making the little white-haired girl stare at her in shock, but soon she stopped when she remembered that the woman beside her could kill her with a sneeze. While all this was going on, Tatsuya, who decided to prepare food for the others, was sitting in a corner reading a book, while patting Kuroka, who was lying on his lap with a smile on her face. Grafia, who was somehow able to convince Tatsuya to let her do the work, was preparing the dinner for all of them, while wearing just an apron, saying that she is feeling hot for being so long on the beach. Tatsuya, who was silently reading his book, occasionally glanced towards the silver-haired woman, who was working in the kitchen with a mischievous smirk on her face. Kuroka, who was lying on her lap, said, "It's hitting me, nya, don't be this naughty, nya." Tatsuya looked down towards his lap and saw Kuroka looking at him with a smile while poking the bulge in his pants. Grafia, who heard this, smiled and said, "If you want, I can help you with your stress." Tatsuya didn't say anything and continued to read his book, and soon his bulge disappeared and he thought, "Like you are not already planning to do the same," and saw Grafia putting something in a set of cutlery. Kuroka, who smelled what she put, opened her eyes wide and thought, "So this maid is thinking the same as me, nya," and narrowed her eyes. Tatsuya, who heard that, shook his head and just left the matter be. Later that evening, Grafia set up the table carefully and went to call the others, not noticing a certain black cat sneaking in the room. As some of them people started to come down, Grafia and Kuroka noticed that the trainees are not here yet. Seeing their confusion, Tatsuya said, "They all are already asleep. Just let them be, they will eat it when they wake up." All of them then sat down to eat, and just immediately Kuroka and Grafia peeked towards Tatsuya's direction, who didn't notice them and continued to eat with a smile on his face. Tatsuya then looked towards Grafia, making her flinch, and said, "It's delicious, Grafia." Hearing that, Grafia and, for some reason, even Kuroka gave out a sigh and smiled and welcomed him for his compliment. Ruya, who already knew what the cat and the maid were planning, set up a link with Tiamat and asked her, "You noticed?" Tiamat, who heard a voice in her head, did not freak out and calmly said, "Yeah, so what the plan?" Ruya chuckled and said, "What else? Join the raid." "You in?" Tiamat smiled and said, "Yup." Suddenly both of them heard a voice at the same time. "Just come after everyone else is asleep. I don't want Milikas asking me why there were so many girls entering your room at night." Both of them flinched and immediately looked towards Tatsuya, who simply continued to eat his dinner while talking with Milikas and making him eat the things that he was keeping at the side of his plate. Chapter 196. Punishment. After everyone was done having dinner, and Tatsuya prepared some food and kept in the girls in Saji's room. He then entered the bathroom, and after taking his bath he went to his room. All this while Grafia and Kuroka were waiting patiently for the others to fall asleep, while thinking that Tatsuya might be having difficulty to sleep. Once both of them confirmed that everyone was asleep, they slowly made their move towards Tatsuya's room. Once both of them came closer to his room, they noticed each other, and immediately there was a moment of silence and tension in the atmosphere. Both of them stared at each other for a while till Kuroka said, "So you used the same tactic as me, right?" Grafia looked at her for a while with her usual cold expression on her face and then said, "No use fretting over it. Both of us got the same idea and did the same thing, I guess." And once again there was silence for a while, but suddenly both of them said at the same time, "Let's head in together." And both of them stared at each other for a while before a chuckle left their mouth. Kuroka and Grafia then slowly opened the door, entered her to not make any noise, and silently entered the room and closed the door behind them. The room was completely dark, but being devils, both of them didn't have any problems with their vision. Kuroka and Grafia looked towards the bed and smiled and said at the same time, "Just as I planned, huh? Once he wakes up he will be uncontrollable." Both of them started to approach his bed, but stopped once they heard the door opening behind them. They turned around and saw Ruya and Tiamat enter the room, and seeing the devil and Nekashu already in the room, both of them waved their hands, and Ruya said, "Well, looks like both of you are very impatient to come here this soon. Man, I guess it was to be expected if you were the ones who put that in his food." Hearing that, both Kuroka and Grafia were surprised. Their plan was already known to the two standing in front of them, and Grafia asked, "So you two already knew what we were doing?" Tiamat nodded her head and said, "Yep." Kuroka then asked, "And you didn't try to stop Tatsuya from eating that food?" Kurumi shook her head and said, "Why would we do that? And besides, do you really think that everything is going according to your plan?" Both Kuroka and Grafia looked at each other, and then back at the two dragons with a deadpan look and said, "Of course is Everth dash. ING is going just as I planned," said a voice which was familiar to all four of them, and immediately both Kuroka and Grafia got stiff and slowly turned their head towards the sofa present inside the room. Just as they turned their heads, the sofa, which was lying vacant, suddenly had a person sitting on it while reading a book. Tatsuya put a bookmark on the page he was reading, and the book disappeared from his hand. He then stood up from his place and stretched his body and said, "Man, I didn't know you guys would take this long." Ruya and Tiamat chuckled on seeing the reaction of the other two, and then said, "Well, the Gremory boy was very excited and took a lot longer to fall asleep." Tatsuya just nodded his head and said, "Well, as long as he enjoying, I guess it is fine. Well, whatever. Let's get on the business, shall we?" Tatsuya said, and walked towards the bed. Seeing him acting normally, both Kuroka and Grafia were confused and asked, "Aren't feeling a bit different?" Tatsuya looked at the two for a while and then smiled and said, "Oh, I knew about the aphrodisiac and my body immediately detoxified it. So I am as healthy as I can be." Hearing that, both Grafia's and Kuroka's eyes widened in shock, and both of them shouted at the same time, "You took on an aphrodisiac which can make even a dragon king/god excited. For days AMD you are still fine." And this time it was the time for the other three in the room to flinch in surprise and stare at the two girls with widened eyes. All three of them then sighed, and Tiamat said, I am thankful that Tatsuya didn't decide to swap the dishes and just detoxified it. I don't want to think what would have happened if someone else have eaten that food. Ruya chuckled and then said, that would have been hilarious, especially if that Vritra boy would have eaten it. He probably would have been in so much pain after that training he went through. Fuck, I can't even imagine it. Tatsuya massaged his temples for a while, and then said, for all things I am glad that it was not Millikas who ate that. Seriously, you two, from where did you got something that potent? Kuroka then said with a confident smile and said, I borrowed it from the goddess called Aphrodite after Valley decided to fight some gods from that Parthenon. Graphia just said, trade secret, and stood silent. Tatsuya stared at the maid for a while, and finally sighed in defeat. Whatever, I will just punish you two for this, and smirked and pulled all of them towards him with his telekinesis and made a time dilation field around the room. He then used the same medicine that both of them used on him, and for the whole night the room was filled with noises of the girls shouting on receiving their punishment. Chapter 197. Big treatments take longer to cure. Time skip, 10 days. After 10 days of intense training/torture, Tatsuya's group, along with the 2 dragon sacred gear wielders, were allowed to take a day off from the training. They all were so glad about it that Saji and Isami even shed some tears of joy while the other girls nodded on seeing the two and remembered the first time they started training. For them, it was nostalgic on seeing their juniors acting like that. During these 10 days, Tatsuya made them go through so much physical tortures that their bodies were now resistant to some amount of pain. For Saji, he can take on any attack from mid-low class level being like they're nothing and was himself at high mid-class level, and that is if he is not using his sacred gear. Isami too have improved, but her training with him from earlier made her capable of fighting low-high class being without her sacred gear, and with her balance breaker she can now take on peak high-class beings with ease, though people like Sarorg and completely serious Riser were still in another league for her, but she can easily handle Rias. The girls from Tatsuya's group who have been on a bottleneck for more than a year finally broke through, and were now all of them were Satan class beings though low Satan class. Ingvild and Kurumi, who were already in Satan class level, made great progress, as well as Ingvild broke through and became mid-Satan class level, and Kurumi was at the bottleneck of her peak Satan class level. Both of them were very glad because of the increase in their powers, as both of them had been stuck on their previous levels for past 2 years, and that is not considering the time that they spent in Time Chamber. Ingvild also was now able to control her superclass power effectively though for a short amount of time, and now could go to low superclass level for half an hour per day. And just like other superclass devils, she too changes her form. In her super form, her violet hair turns blue with a glow coming out of her body of the same color as well. She also gains a leviathan's tail, and her skin gets covered with leviathan scales, making her look more like a humanoid leviathan. Seeing that Ingvild getting back to her super form, the rest of the teammates were happy for her and congratulated her, with Kurumi being the most enthusiastic among all of them, as both her and Ingvild have been close in strength for quite a long time and consider each other as their rivals. Seeing that her rival got a hang of her original power, Kurumi felt a little left out since she required to enter Tatsuya's body in order to go to her tailed beast form. Hearing her problem, Tatsuya just stared at her for a while and said, "You really are an idiot, aren't you?" He then lifted his shirt, which revealed his chiseled body to all of them, making the 4 girls who have been going on with him during the night daily blush a bit. Tatsuya ignored the looks that they were giving to him and focused on his body, and soon some black inscriptions appeared on his belly. Tatsuya simply released the seal but didn't remove it, because if he did, Kurumi will be immediately sent back to the astral plane. But Kurumi, who didn't know that, widened her eyes in shock and immediately grabbed Tatsuya's hand in order to stop him and said, "What are you doing? Don't you know that a person will die if a failed beast is removed from its body?" And immediately tried to put the seal back on him. But Tatsuya grabbed her hand and said, Whoa, wait a bit. I don't have any intention to die, and for your information, I have only released the seal, not removed the seal. You are still a part of me. So don't stress too much about it. Besides, do you think that something like removing a tailed beast from my body will kill me?" Hearing that, all of them remained silent for a while, and Kurumi felt embarrassed by thinking that something like this could harm him. Ruya, who was standing on the sides, chuckled and said, "A person who have been keeping up with me in bad for 10 days would not suffer from something like this." But immediately all the girls who have been training for the Pat 10 day looked at her, making Ria and smirk at them, while Graphia, Kuroka, and Tiamat smirked as well. Seeing their smirk, the others immediately glared back at them, and then dragged Tatsuya along with them to his bedroom. There was no news from any of them for 3 days after that incident. 3 days later, the door of Tatsuya's room opened and Tatsuya came out of the room while stretching his body. His muscles felt a bit sore from all the hard work that he did for all those 3 days, not to mention he put a time dilation barrier around the room at that. He then silently went towards the bathroom and thought, "It took 12 days to make them pass out, huh? Looks like the training is effective in more than one way." After he was done with his bath and was feeling refreshed, he went out of his mansion and saw Graphia and Venolana teaching Milikas how to handle his demonic energy, while Saji would take out any excess energy that he had with his sacred gear. Once Tatsuya's figure was visible to them, Saji immediately greeted him, followed by the others, with Milikas immediately rushing towards him and asking him to play with him. Tatsuya just smiled and agreed to the adorable Gremory's request, and decided to take the ones who were still awake to the amusement park in his dimension. Saji declined though, since he wanted to rest up a bit more, knowing that his training will begin soon, and went inside the mansion. On his way, Milikas, who was in Tatsuya's shoulders, asked, "Onyai-chan, where are Miyuki-san and the others?" Tatsuya, whose smile wavered for a bit, controlled himself and said, "After all that training, they all felt a bit sick, so I gave them the medicine. and now they are sleeping to recover. Millicast looked at him for a while and then asked, "But you took 3 days." To his question, Graphia said, "Big dick. Cough cough, asterisk treatments take longer to ple asterisk cough, asterisk cure Milika-sama." Hearing that, all the people who knew what treatment was going on looked at her, and then stared towards Tatsuya's lower half, and immediately Kaneko and Rosweiss had an intense blush on their faces while Venolana just kept a hand on her mouth and said, Era. Tatsuya just ignored the looks he was getting and went with Millicast to the rides he wanted to go while the others just enjoyed on their own. Chapter 198. Tatsuya v/S Tatsuya's group. After enjoying to their heart's content in the amusement park, all of them went back and noticed all the girls from the Tatsuya's group cooking in the kitchen. He and the others tried to help them but were rejected by the girls who continued to do their work. Soon the girls were done, and all of them had dinner together, after which everyone just went back to sleep. A few days later, Tatsuya could be seen flying in the air with a book in hand, dodging the attacks coming towards him from the girls of his group. All of them had their weapons out, and Kurumi and Ingvild were even in their tailed beast and super form respectively, with Ingvild even using her sacred gear as they were fighting over the ocean. The other girls also were releasing their immense aura while firing their attacks and trying to strike him as well, but Tatsuya would simply dodge or just push them away, which sending them flying back a few hundred meters or so. The others who were watching the fight go on were sweating bullets, just seeing how much destruction each of their attacks was causing, but still the shocking display of Tatsuya, just evading all of them, left them speechless. Seeing their fight, the devil's eyes were fixed on him, with Saji and Millicast having their respect towards Tatsuya increased tenfold. Both of them knew that their Aniki/brother was strong, but just seeing him in action made him practically seem like a god to them. Meanwhile, the dragons were also excited on seeing the fight. Drake, who was inside the gauntlet, even though didn't want to fight him head-on once again. His dragon blood, which was boiling on seeing the fight, was making it difficult for him to calm down. Same was the case for Vritra and Tiamat, who were holding themselves back from fighting them, although Tiamat had made up her mind to fight with Kurumi once this was over. Knowing that Kurumi had access to her true form without Tatsuya's help made her want to beat the shit out of the vixen who was bragging so much about regaining her full power for quite a few days. But still, the one having the most difficult time were Rosweiss and Ruya. Rosweiss because she was just completely shaken by the display of strength by the group and was not doing a good job to hold on to her sanity. She has learned it before that there are a lot of beings in the world who can destroy entire countries with ease, but seeing such a display with her own eyes was something which shook her to the core. Ruya, on the other hand, was way too eager to fight Tatsuya. It was very rare for her to find someone strong enough who can fight with her, and seeing that there was someone like that in front of him and is still not able to fight him made her frustrated, since she was not allowed to fight Tatsuya. The reason for that was other than Tatsuya's and Vala's group. Along with Kaneko, nobody knew her real identity and was introduced to the others as Tatsuya's cousin, and if she were to show her real power to others, the fact that Great Red has left the dimensional gap would be out and will cause a huge amount of headache for Tatsuya, who is currently sheltering her. There is also the fact that if both her and Tatsuya were to fight, the chances of his dimension to be destroyed were quite high, and he really was not in the mood to rebuild everything from scratch. These facts made her very irritated, and she had decided to drag him back to the dimensional gap and have an all-out fight with him. Now back to the Tatsuya's group. Currently Miyuki, Himari, Kagura, Asia, Shizuka, Karen, and Ingvild all were all trying to slash or hit Tatsuya, who was just dodging their attacks, just marginally, so as to make them a bit more frustrated for missing him so closely, and just as his intention, all of them were gritting their teeth as they were unable to land even a single hit on him and were glaring at Tatsuya with the intention to kill him, knowing that without that they didn't stand a chance. Tatsuya, who was not bothered by their killing intent, just kept reading his book and slowly turned the page with an amused expression on his face. Seeing that action, the girls just got angrier and their aura got even more messier than before. Miyuki, who was just on the brink on going to the dark side against her Oni-sama, looked back and shouted, "Hey bitch! Aren't you ready yet? Just fire that goddamn bomb thing of yours, you glowing shit of a fox. And Sanan, use more explosive power in your shots. We have not kept you in the back to fuck yourself. Show motivation here. We need power. You understand. We need P.O.W.E.R. So just stop wasting time or I will skewer your asses with a HUHE spike." And continued to attack Tatsuya. Kurumi and Sanan, who themselves were frustrated because of continuing to miss him, felt even more agitated by Miyuki's words. Sanan aura started to go haywire at a crazy rate, and she said, "You want fire power, right, ice bitch?" She then kept her weapon back and said, "Then you got it," and raised her hand up in the air. A huge black cannon started to manifest in her hand, almost twice her size. She then pointed the cannon towards Tatsuya and the girls and said in a malicious tone, "Lock on," and started adding her magic, chakra, and ki, all three of them at once, making Kurumi, who was near her, glance at her in surprise and think, "This will hit hard." But soon a grin appeared on her face and she said, "So let's do the same as well," and started adding the sage energy to the tailed beast bomb that she was making it almost the same size as her body. Feeling the immense pressure coming from them, the audience just gulped their saliva and were waiting for the outcome of the battle enthusiastically. The girls who were fighting Tatsuya also looked back and noticed what they were doing and looked at each other. They continued to stare at each other for a while and suddenly nodded in unison and teleported near the two girls and started to pour all they had left in the tank all at once in the final attack. Tatsuya, who had now stopped moving since he was not receiving any attacks, just read the book silently, not minding his teammates trying to fire a continent destroying at him without any hesitation at all. All of them didn't think much about him not moving from the spot. It was just more convenient for them if he was not moving. Miyuki then started to concentrate all her remaining energy and used her wind and ice attribute to form a meteorite-size ice Rasen shuriken. Himari went into her cured mode, which turned her hair completely wet while her claws get sharpened and black marks appeared on her body. She then raised her katana as a huge violet flame instead of the regular blue flame emerged from it and took a form of a lion. Ingvild, who was in her super form, used her remaining power along with her sacred gear to form a leviathan out of water, almost 50 m in size with water in it moving at a very high speed. Asia and Shizuka, who was not really used to long-ranged attacks, just simply formed a huge spheres of pure energy to fire at him, though Asia used her negative healing attribute, which was as strong as power of destruction of the Bale clan. Kagura raised her katana as well, and a huge sword made of lighting appeared over it and was ready to attack at any time. All of them continued to charge the attacks to the maximum they could while the audience just watched the scene in front of them in both horror and excitement. Tatsuya, who was not bothering to look at the continent-destroying attack, aimed at him, closed the book he was reading and said, "HH, I finally finished it." He then stretched his body and said, "Well, let's end this training, I'm feeling a bit hungry." But the girls ignored him and just fired all their attacks at Tatsuya, all at once not thinking twice about firing a continent-destroying attack at him. Tatsuya just looked at the attack coming towards him with a calm expression on his face and took out his gun and fired at all the incoming attacks, successfully nullifying all of them in an instant, making all of them open their mouths in shock while they stared at the attacks disappearing in thin air. Tatsuya just stretched his body and said, "That packed quite a punch, it really took a lot of my energy to nullify them. You all really have improved. Fine, I will make all your favorites today. So look forward to the feast." And just flew back to the mansion in order to prepare the said feast, leaving behind all of them completely speechless because of the anticlimactic end. Chapter 199. Back to the underworld. Currently the Tatsuya and the others were preparing their luggage to hoe back to the underworld. The 20-day training camp have come to an end, which showed a great result for all of them. Even Saji, whom Tatsuya had started training just recently, was able to make a great progress with his sacred gears, and Tatsuya could surely say that currently he might be the strongest in Sona's peerage. Isami as well was able to get used to her Dragon Slayer magic and was now able to use it in combat as well. Once all were done preparing, Tatsuya looked towards Kuroka and said, "You will be going back to Valley and the others directly, right?" To which Kuroka nodded and gave peck to Tatsuya and teleported back to her hideout. Tatsuya and his group then changed their appearance back to their teenage forms and then teleported back to the Gremory mansion as well, while leaving behind Ruya, who decided to year around the world for a few days. Tiamat then took her leave as she said that she had to take care of the young dragons back at the familiar forest. Hearing her, Venolana and Grafia also took their leave as they had their work as the finance manager and head maid on them. And now only the kids and Rosweiss was left in the room. Rosweiss looked at the other women leaving for their work, got depressed and said, "Now that I think about it, I am still jobless," and slumped her shoulders. Tatsuya looked at the silver-haired woman and said, "Then want to work for me?" Rosweiss looked at Tatsuya for a while and then asked, "What kind of work would it be?" Tatsuya then said, "Well, it depends on you. Whether you want to cooperate in the supernatural business or you want to work in a more normal human-like way, or both." Rosweiss gave it a thought for a while and then said, "What might he the positions in all those respective categories?" Tatsuya and her then sat down on the sofas and started discussing, seeing which the others left the room and decided to check on how the others have been after the training session. Tatsuya and Rosweiss continued to discuss for quite a long time, and finally it was decided that Rosweiss would be dealing with both natural and supernatural jobs and would be working as his secretary. Tatsuya decided to give her this position as he already heard how much Odin made her work on her own and was surprised to see that she alone was working more than all his clones at his restaurant combined, and by no means Tatsuya used to work less. He just gave her a look of pity and decided to give her a high salary compared to what he used to give to others, not because he was pitying her, but because the work which was assigned to her would greatly reduce the number of clones that he used to form and all the information overload he used to receive in his head when they disappear in smoke. It was not like he had problem in managing the data on his own, but if someone else was willing to do it for him, he would happily allow that person to do it. He already have a lot to do with managing multiple companies and restaurant chains coupled with his school and supernatural business. Rosweiss, who now had a new job, was feeling happy because not only her job was better than the last one, the salary was better as well, and she also got a chance to learn some of the magic that he and his group used during the time they were at his dimension, which highly intrigued her. Tatsuya, who was now sitting in front of his new secretary, decided to send her back to his home and start working from today and prepare the reports so that he can go through them once he goes back to Kuo in a day or two. Rosweiss, who received her first task from her new boss, happily nodded her head and teleported back to Shiba residence. Later that day, Tatsuya and the others met Rias and her peerage, and Tatsuya was immediately tackled by Gasper, who started ranting about how Azazel threw him into a scary place filled with people. Tatsuya was somehow able to calm him down, and then Zenobia came forward and said, "I want a rematch to see how much have I improved," which immediately piqued the interest of the Gremory peerage, except for Isami. Tatsuya, who heard her, just smirked and asked, "Sure, let's duel it out," and took out his spoon and motioned her to follow him. Seeing him still fighting with a spoon made Zenobia feel irritated, seeing that he was not taking her seriously. The group who fought Tatsuya just a few days ago then thought, Compared to you, he fought all of us just with a book in his hand for the whole time. Zenovia and Tatsuya were now standing in front of each other in the Grimoire training field while the others were sitting on the sides. Tatsuya, who was holding his spoon like a rapier, was looking towards Zenovia, who was in her bodysuit with her Durandal on her shoulders. Miyuki, who was acting as a referee, just looked at both of them with a bored expression and said, "Just start it off," and walked away without bothering to watch them closely. She believed that it was pointless because all the moves that Zenovia would make would be hardly missed by her eyes, and if Tatsuya decided to use something complex, then not even Ruya could tell what he did. So thinking that it was totally pointless to act as a referee, she just took a distance and used her ice magic to make a throne for herself and sat on it like a queen and watched the fight. Zenovia, who had already experienced charging directly at him, decided to take a safe approach this time. Tatsuya, who saw that, smiled and asked, "Hey, not going to jump on me?" But Zenovia didn't answer him and continued to stare at him. Tatsuya just smirked and said, "Then let me make the first move," and casually threw his spoon up in the sky, making the Grimoire peerage confused by his action. Zenovia too looked at the spoon in surprise but was suddenly startled. "Never get your eyes off your opponent." And Zenovia immediately turned around to see Tatsuya standing behind her, but before she could do anything, Tatsuya pushed a pressure point in her hand, making it go numb, and snatched Durandal from Zenovia and aimed at her neck. "It's my win, I guess." Zenovia just looked at him for a while but soon have a sigh and said, "Looks like it." Looked down. Tatsuya lowered the sword as well and pushed it on the ground and healed the numbness in her hand and said, "Well, don't fret too much. I can tell you have improved, it's just that your enemy was way above your league." Zenovia then looked at him with widened eyes, but soon nodded her head, realizing that what he said was absolutely correct. She then stored her sword back and then said, "Next time I will beat you." Tatsuya just called his spoon back to him using his telekinesis and said, "Sure, me and my spoon will look forward to that day," and walked away while swinging his spoon between his fingers. Zenovia started following him as well while asking tips from him to improve herself. Chapter 200. Return to Kuo. After the duel with Zenovia, Tatsuya and the others went inside for dinner, and after resting for the night decided to go back to the human world, which made Milikas, Grafia, and Venolana very sad, but they knew that they had to go back to their normal lives. Milikas though said that he would soon come to meet him in Kuo, to which Tatsuya consented with a smile on his face. Tatsuya and the others thanked everyone in the Grimoire mansion for their help during the past few days, and then decided to say their goodbyes to the other friends like Sarorg and the others as well. While visiting Sarorg's mansion, he asked for a duel from Tatsuya, who decided to entertain his friend for a bit. After the duel was over, he went to the Phoenix mansion much to the surprise of Riser and his family, though Ravel was very excited and immediately went in the kitchen to bake some sweets for Tatsuya. They all talked for a while, and Isami also took some notes from Jessica Phoenix about manipulating her fire. After they were done, they left for the train station and met up with Citri Peerage, who was accompanied by Serafal, much to Sona's displeasure. Serafal immediately hugged Tatsuya like a koala and tried to make him stay for a few more days, only to be shot down by Tatsuya, which made her feel sad. Tatsuya, who saw her looking depressed, sighed and said, "Hey, Sarah, how about we put up a magical girl even like the last time at my shop? Of course Sona will be working as well." Hearing that, both the sisters looked towards Tatsuya, one with fear and the other with excitement. Serafal immediately nodded her head and said, "Sure, let's do that. I will prepare the cutest costume for my magical girl Sotan." Sona tried to make them give up on the idea, but the two totally ignored her, making her crouch down in corner with a depressed aura around her. Seeing that, Tsubaki and Rias started to comfort their childhood friend. Once their train arrived, all of them get on it and started their journey back to Kuo. On the whole way, there was discussion among both the peerages about how their training went, during which Isami and Saji just kept quiet, not wanting to remember the torture they went through, and just sat in a corner. Once they all were back home, Rias and Sona reminded all of them that they should make sure that their holiday homework is complete, if not the reputation of their clubs will worsen. Hearing that, both Isami, Zenovia, and some girls from Citri group and Saji got shocked as they just remembered about that stuff and were panicking. Only Tatsuya and his group were calm about the situation, and it was not because they had already done the homework. No, they haven't even started it yet. The fact that they were not panicking was that they had a private time chamber in their house coupled with their shadow clones. It would just take them a few minutes of real-world time to be done with it. Isami and Zenovia immediately teleported back to the Grimoire girls' dorm, leaving behind the others, who left soon as well after saying goodbyes to Tatsuya and the others. Tatsuya made a clone of himself and instructed it to go through the homework while he was going to check how well did his new secretary do her job. Tatsuya then teleported to the office he had given to Rosweiss, which was just a soundproof room in his house. Once he came in the room, Rosweiss, who was sitting in her desk and doing some stuff, freaked out and pointed her sword at him, but soon panicked when she noticed that it was her new boss who she was pointing her sword at. "Kaya. Tatsuya-sama, sorry about this. I was not expecting you to suddenly appear in front of me. Please don't fire me," and immediately lowered her head. Tatsuya looked at her overreacting secretary and said, "No need to worry about that. I am not bothered by it. So raise your head." Rosweiss looked up and had some tears in her eyes, seeing which Tatsuya offered her a handkerchief, which she gratefully accepted. Tatsuya then said, "Now then, if you have calmed down, give me the report on everything." Rosweiss immediately went to her secretary mode and nodded her head and handed some documents to Tatsuya, while she also explained him some of the points in her reports. Tatsuya, who saw the compiled reports, was a bit surprised seeing how well she had done her work and was happy to know that she made a good choice in making her his secretary. Once they both were done, both of them gave a tired sigh and leaned back on the sofas. Tatsuya looked at Rosweiss and said, "Good job, Rosweiss. You did stood up to my expectations." Rosweiss, who heard Tatsuya's words, got a bit embarrassed as she was not used to hearing praise for her work and said, "I am happy that I was of use to you." Tatsuya just chuckled and said, "No need to be so reserved. You can give yourself more credit. Anyways, and then stood up from his seat and asked, "It is almost time for dinner. Is there anything that you want to eat?" "Ah, and no need to hold back. Today is the celebration of you joining our group, so you can let your imagination run wild." Hearing that, Rosweiss felt happy. She was not treated this good ever since she started working as a Valkyrie, and seeing him giving this much importance to someone who just joined them was something she was not used to. She teared up a bit, but soon wiped her eyes. Tatsuya then offered her his hand and said, "Well, let's call the others and head off to the restaurant." Rosweiss nodded happily, and then took his hand, and went with him to where the others were. Tatsuya then stopped in front of a door and said, "Oh, and Rosweiss, since you have joined our ranks, there is one thing that you should make sure of." Tatsuya looked at her, and with a smile on his face said, "The things we talk about amongst ourselves, or the things that you see, should not be leaked to the others, not even your family, if they are not a part of our group, or have my permission." "Understood." Rosweiss, who saw Tatsuya smile, felt a shiver, and immediately nodded her head. Even though her new boss was very nice, he is very dangerous as well. Tatsuya then smiled as well and said, "Good. Just so you know, if I come to know you have given someone information either intentionally or unintentionally, then be prepared for the worst." And then knocked on the door. Rosweiss, who heard the warning, took a step back and resolved herself to not even say a word to anyone. She was happy with her life and didn't plan of giving up on living anytime soon. Soon the door was opened by Tatsuya's clone, who on seeing Rosweiss and Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Don't worry, they have almost finished their work." Tatsuya nodded and went in the room and saw multiple clones of his girls working on their homeworks, while those who didn't have any to begin with were just lazing around. Tatsuya and Rosweiss then took a seat near them as well, and Tatsuya took out a fan of beer and gave it to Rosweiss, who immediately forgot the threat that Tatsuya just have her and started gulping down the drink. Seeing her, the other three chuckled and started drinking theirs as well, and waited for the others to finish their homework.